Good afternoon. So let's resume our activities for this IX Forum 2026. I'd like to start by inviting Savio Moraes from IX.br. He will give us a overlook of IPv6 in Brazil. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Savio Moraes. I am in charge of IPv6 at IX.br. And I'd like to talk to you about what we're doing in order to expanding our role at IX.br and to increase the use of IPv6 here in Brazil. So since we started, we first diagnosed the current scenario. So we have already been working with service providers in autonomous systems, but the idea of expanding it requires us to go over statistics and understand the current Brazilian scenario. We already have data from many suppliers indicating that 50 to 60% of Brazilians already access the internet or internet content via IPv6. But it's also important to understand why the other half is not using IPv6. So to reach a more in-depth diagnosis. Besides that, we also want to understand online content available in Brazil. We're talking about domestic streaming, public services, on IPv6 or not. So this survey has started. We have this portal, Panorama IPv6.br. You can access it. I am not going to share any slides, but I'd like to show you the website and then to share some interesting data we have gathered. First thing we learned is with regards to BGP, we carried out a historical a history of BGP, how things have changed in Brazil, and we found the results very interesting to data that was shared yesterday. And we also got data from LACNIC and IX.br. So here you can see the scenario from 2003 to date. So always at the beginning so that we understand how this is being assigned. And we have then working with how you can work with that and BGP. So this shows the history. So you can see that around 2011, there was an exhaustion of IPv4 blocks. And then, but that did not translate necessarily into increasing the announcements. So here you can see this change of having an increase in prefixes. But another interesting point in time is around 2020, 2021. And then you see we are at the end of IPv4 at LACNIC, and then we see an increase in requests, and once there's an exhaustion, we see a decrease in delegated IPv6. But at the same time, that is very positive. So here you can see the activation over the last 5 years, and you can see that we are getting closer to the prefixes that have been delegated. Besides that, another study was carried out. So when a prefix was assigned and then its use started, you can see that there is a decrease in this green line. This happens till 2021. And after that, we see this low number that's flat. So most of the networks, they start then making such announcements. The page also shows you regional distribution. You can see that most of the prefixes are in the south and southeast, or towards the state of Bahia in the northern, or in the northeast. This graph shows how many of the prefixes in the Brazilian states were delegated but with no announcements. So in Brasilia, for example, or the federal district, is where you'll find most of prefixes with announcements. So this is kind of concerning because in Brazil we have most of the public services. So we see many public services that are headquartered over there, but they do not announce their BGP prefixes. As for testing online content, first we checked the websites, and one of the studies we carried out was to study the domains of public organizations. And then we had that, we carried out the tests, and you can see over here, almost 4,000 domains, a little bit less than that actually, but out of the almost 4,400, only had this COM-A. That means that we don't know the IP or the IPv6 underlying that. And the other 90%, they have the content available only on IPv4. When we examine that in depth, we can see that the content is available on IPv6 for 124. And then another study was conducted. Based on such domains, we went over the resolution and studied which autonomous system is doing that, and if they are announcing IPv6. What we learned is that there is a reasonable quantity of organizations hosting that, but there are in autonomous systems announcing IPv6. So sometimes it's just a matter of changing the configuration and then enable DNS, and that would make the content available. We also ranked the major IPv6 hosting, exclusive hosting, and we can see that 60% of sites with IPv6 is under Cloudflare, which is the first autonomous system, and we also studied those that are only on IPv4, but that could enable IPv6. And we can see that the first autonomous system is Amazon. So you may be hosting something on Amazon. IPv6 is not enabled, but it's not difficult for you to do that and then have that on DNS. Also for regional distribution, Goiás, Acre, and one more state here in the northern part of Brazil, they account for 40% of the content already available on dual tech. And Rondônia here in red. In our sampling in this initial studies, there were not many IPv6 websites, but we talked to the government of the state of the state, and they said that most of the domains open to the public are on IPv6, especially for those who are end users and not providers. So in order to enable IPv6, we also checked against the three branches of public services, the judiciary, the legislative, and the executive. All of them close to 10 to 14% in dual tech. We also focused on companies, same sampling. And here you can see that 80% of the websites do not have IPv6, but in many situations, they could enable IPv6 at the server level, so dual stack. Something else we did, we also went over the domains, and then we examined that based on economic activity classification. And you can see that the ratios are very similar: commerce, ICTs, and industry. And based on the database we tested, you can see that all of them are close to 20%, so better than in the public services. So the private organizations are using IPv6 more than public services. When we go over regions, it's a bit more homogeneous. So it looks much better. I'd like just to highlight the state of Piauí with a percentage that's above the average, 30%, and the state of Pernambuco with only 7% of the content available. When we ranked just as for IPv6 hosting, you can see iCloud Player here leading, but here you can see the top five. First, Amazon, but the second is a National Autonomous Service, local web. And it's easier for us to get in touch with them. They do provide content on IPv6, and it's easy for you to talk to them. And it's also easier for you to discuss that with a private organization. And from these pieces of information, and this is what we have so far, this is what we can share with you, but we will carry out further studies regarding content and also running some tests on traffic. We also want to include some information about internet exchange points, also to prepare materials for technical and non-technical managers on how they can enable IPv6 at their companies for technicians and developers. So when developing an app, how can you ensure that it will support IPv6, or if it's something you have already developed, which are the points you need to ensure in order to support IPv6? And we are also now testing some tools used by the public services in order to make sure they are supported by IPv6. And that's what we plan to do in the future. Well, I'm running out of time, but I'm available here to entertain your questions. Thank you very much.
Temos perguntas para o Sávio aqui na
Are there
plateia.
any questions to Savio from the audience? It seems we have a question from the online audience.
Vou tentar ser animado igual o Anderson.
Well, let me try to
Tem uma
be
pergunta aqui
as
do
cheerful
Henrique
as
Godoy.
Anderson. We have a question
Boas
from Mr.
práticas
Godoy.
realmente conseguem mudar o cenário de pouca
Can best
adesão de
practices
clientes e
really
serviços
change
na
this
prefeitura, ou
poor
ainda dependemos de ações mais fortes como
adoption at
exigências do IPv6
municipality
em licitações?
administration? Or do we need to work
Obrigado pela
on
pergunta,
that, on
Henry.
the adopting
Essa é uma das
IPv6,
coisas que a gente
working
está
with
fazendo um
some
estudo focado dentro
requests for
do serviço
proposals?
público, porque
We
muitas
are
das coisas
studying that
que eu já
for the
ouvi
public
conversando com o pessoal
organizations.
de prefeituras, de
I have
câmaras de
talked
vereadores
to
e várias outras
the
instituições públicas,
council,
é que muitas vezes a
town
infraestrutura ainda não
members, and
está
what I
preparada,
hear is
seja
that
porque a última
oftentimes
licitação que teve
infrastructure
do
has
provedor de
not
acesso não
is
inclui
not ready
IPv6
yet
e não tem como
because
adicionar,
in the
né? A
previous
gente está
bid
nesse
IPv6
momento
was
de
not
fazer uma troca
included,
de licitação,
and at this point in
ou o
time they
próprio
would have to
equipamento, ou
change the
algum sistema
equipment
muitas vezes
or to change a
que não
system,
foi feito pensando no IPv6, né?
because in
Então
the
esse tipo de
past
ajuda
they had
também
not considered
o Henry
IPv6.
está me ajudando também nesse mapeamento,
And he's
principalmente na
also
parte de
helping me
equipamentos
in
agora. E a gente deve
mapping,
publicar
particularly
uma
equipment.
atualização de um
And we will
documento lá
probably
que a gente
publish an
produziu há muito tempo
update.
atrás do RIPE, para
There
ajudar
is
esse
a
pessoal
RIPE
que está fazendo compras
document,
de equipamento, seja por licitação ou
and
seja
we
compra
will then
direta,
add
especificar quais
talking
dispositivos
about equipment and also to
quais
discuss
requisitos do IPv6 devem estar
which
ali nos
are the
requisitos
IPv6
no
requirements that
dispositivo.
should be
E é isso, a
then
gente está focando nisso também.
presented.
Obrigado pela
So we are
pergunta, Henry.
focusing on that. Thank you very much.
Mais alguma pergunta, Lucas?
Are there any other questions, Lucas?
Beleza. Bom, deixa eu fazer uma pergunta para você.
I have a
Assim,
question.
recentemente, sim, a gente tem ouvido falar
More
de
recently,
dificuldade, né, de uso de IPv6 com o pessoal de games.
we hear from the people in the gaming area that IPv6 is an issue. So is there any plans? So are you going to start playing games in order to test it?
Testes
We plan
pesquisas
to
nas
run some
faculdades,
tests and
mas
also
também nesse
to
momento a gente está focando mais dentro do
hold
conteúdo
some
nacional,
more
né?
in-depth
Focando em dentro do Brasil fazer
studies.
todas as
But right
provas.
now we
Com
want to
certeza
focus
isso está
on Brazil.
na nossa meta,
But of course,
focar
this
mais,
is
fazer
also
mais testes para
part
entender
of our goal.
por que
So
que os jogos
to run
ainda muitas
more
vezes não
tests and
aceitam
try to
o
understand why
IPv6, não são
games
configurados dentro dos
are not
contextos,
really
mas
running
pelo
on
menos nesse primeiro momento
IPv6.
a gente não está focando
But
o
right
nosso
now we
enfoque
are
nessa
not
parte.
focusing on this area that
Obrigado,
much.
Sávio.
Okay, thank you so much, Savio.
Palmas aí pro Sávio.
Okay, so let's
Começa.
give it up to Savio. And this is your token. Thank you. Let's have a picture. Great.
Bom, dando continuidade aqui à nossa programação,
So, moving on with our program, we're now going to have a panel to talk about the transformation of voice interconnection and the role of IXBR and IC/X. And so I wanted to invite Rafael from Telesynth. He's going to be the moderator of this panel. And also Alexandre Ferreira from CIPAX, Elton Salvador from Unific, Fábio Cassotti from Anatel, Luiz Henrique Barbosa Silva from Telecom, Neylon Estevan Narciso from Brisanet, and I will also participate in this panel.
Bom, vamos lá, vamos dar continuidade então.
And so we're going to move on with our forum.
Vamos, o Alexandre tem
uma apresentação aqui para passar.
Alexandre has a presentation. Would you like to share it? Well, I can talk quickly about it. The presentation wasn't very long, but the idea of CPX is an old idea, actually, and it came about in 2012 to create an interconnection hub for telephone operators. For those who work with telephone operations, they know how hard it is to ask for a new connection. It's a very bureaucratic process whose protocol must be followed to preserve the security of the system, but it ends up using more effort than we as providers would like to have. And so in 2012, we had the first debate. The technology available at the time was not adequate for the creation of such a hub. And the topic came up again, but with the advance of the CPI technology. But when it was adopted as an interconnection process, this became feasible. And in the beginning of last year, in a conversation with some people from the sector who had challenges dealing with it, we created this model. I invited IX.br to participate as a provider of the required infrastructure to guarantee the security and neutrality of the service. And then in November, we had an offer to the market. The objectives are three: offering a simple mechanism for the operation of exchange, guarantees security and neutrality, to guarantee that those who participate are authorized by Anatel. Also making sure that for every order forwarded via hub is verified to make sure the number is valid according to the authorization received by the operator, and neutral. We are not an operator. We're not a company that competes with these services, offering an intermediate service. The idea of this panel was to exactly bring in all of the stakeholders. Thank you. I will see if I can operate it. Are you ready? So what happened here? I talked a little bit about it, but this is what the hub is. It is an exchange area for traffic. It is mobile and transparent for us. The objectives, as I mentioned, would be to simplify the process and the cost without having problems with the platform and guarantee neutrality. I talked about time. We are already operating. For the time being, it is centered in IX São Paulo at João Dias, and the plan is to expand it as the operators join the service. The idea is that in the future, we're present in all 27 states so that access is facilitated for all participants, especially after 2027, when ASN providers will have access to telephone services. Benefits for the operator. You must have an authorization to participate and to operate with associated numbers and IDs. It's important to mention that if a provider who is part of the hub transports services to another one, it can be done as long as we are aware of it. This represents well what the hub means. We know that if you have interconnection with two operators in a local area, you need two interconnection points. If you use three operators, you must multiply that progressively. And so the idea is for you to, in fact, have a single point. Hub does not treat voice. We only deal with the signals, and there's no possibility to hear the content there. We only deal with the signals. Authentication of the calls. We will guarantee that in a call sent by an operator, the number must belong to that operator or to the one that is being transported, and that is why we must be informed of the RNI. And then, if you verify the origin, it will be absolutely transparent, and likewise, we do not interfere in the business relationship between the participating companies. And then we have the Hub CPX. And then we evaluate this with all of the stakeholders that might benefit from it and try to understand what else we could do. I am a journalist. I'm not an engineer. I'm not a technician, but I hope the technicians can clarify this. I wanted to better understand one thing. CPX will deal with text messages, with voice messages, mobile phones. Any calls will go through the CPE. Well, initially, it's only voice, fixed and mobile. This is very transparent. SMS or text messages, as they are conceived now, we have SMP for the operators, but nothing prevents you from creating such a model. It would have to be improved technologically speaking, but it's not much. But initially, it will only be voice. Okay, so this is something you're creating and putting online, starting with São Paulo. But can the other regions in Brazil already contract that or not? Yes, those who have access to XBR can participate, even if you are in Fortaleza. If you do not have access, but if you have a provider on site, you can hire data transportation and access. This is possible. It's already operational in São Paulo, and throughout the year, we will have it available. And Fortaleza is including one of the areas we want to have it. Well, if you ask me about the role of XBR in this matter, X is hosting this interconnection possibility, but I wanted to know how this partnership works. He said we must have direct connection with XBR. So is it going to be hired, or do we have a contract with XBR? Are there any additionals? Well, for XBR, we only have a traffic exchange, and these are metropolitan areas. The locations are not interconnected, but there is a possibility to have long-distance connection using some type of transportation. This is normal. We were contacted by CPIX about the possibility of using, because it is a network of interconnection of XBR, to make this connection among the different telephone equipment. So we started analyzing. It was a service which went against our rules because we do not provide interconnections between the same ASNs. But we analyzed the service and the benefit it would be to use XBR infrastructure to do that. And so we created a special service for CPIX, and it would be, in other words, a multilateral VLAN where all of these pieces of equipment will be connected. To have access to this type of service, you have to be an XBR participant, that's all. There is you could have a dedicated port or not, and then we will set up one additional VLAN so that AES has access to it. We do not manage the service. We are not going to provide IP address for the connection of equipment within the structure. And basically, this is it. There are no additional charges. We will charge for the setup of VLAN, which is a single charge. And then the rest of it is very transparent. The whole management is because of CPIX. And there is one option now in our dashboard requesting CPIX connectivity. But before that, you must have connected CPIX and make all of the arrangements, because this request must be approved by them so that the process moves on. And Alexandre, how does it operate? How does it work? Is everybody accredited? So how does it work? Are all operators included? Well, the verification we make is basically to verify whether that provider which provided the access has it in place. And we have providers who do not have an IR, but we cannot do it to avoid irregular services provisions. So we do not check anything like with a tax revenue agency or anything like that. We just want to make sure that that company is a legal company, and then we share the guidelines once it is set up. We establish a private IP. This whole traffic uses the private network, and that's it. They're ready to operate. And the deadline that we usually see takes something between 2 or 3 weeks. And once the operator is already connected, we have to adjust the routing. I send the information to SP, it is delivered in the hub, and they move on from there. It really makes internal routing easier. Well, I wanted to better understand this from Nelon and Elton. As operators and providers, have you already started using CPIX? And how does it solve your problems as operators? Well, good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation to participate in this panel. And I also thank all participants. I will say that this is a drug for very strong pain, and small telecommunications, the VPPs are needed. And I will take it to our daily lives here in the state of Ceará and the Northeast region. What are they talking about? What do they want to do with the creation of CPIX. The greatest pain of having a triple plane in your network is having products and services. For an internet provider to have internet alone, there is no market differential. Other services must be provided. So we talked about triple play, which included data. Optic fiber takes the data and the internet to the client's home, and it also took telecom and TV. And this was like 12, 15 years ago. We all look like dinosaurs here, but it is a chronic pain. We've had this pain for 15 years. And if we had conceived this 2 or 3 years ago, the Brazilian telecommunications scenario would be totally different. And the WhatsApp app, for example, would not play the role it does now. So if we could meet the needs of all of the Brazilian markets structured based on these ideals, economically speaking, the triple play of Unific, Brisanet, and other providers, as you can see now, could be totally different. And so what is this? It is a pain. For me, to open a town like Pereira, it would take me 2 or 3 years to obtain interconnection. And what is interconnection? When we have fixed telephones, we have number arrangements. My platform goes up with the numbers, but my clients can call one another. I have an XXX number 1001, 1002. Then I can call my client on the other side, but there is a concept of an island. I can only call my client, but I cannot call Unific client. I cannot call Claro, TIM, and Oi, telephone operators in Brazil. So I had to ask for access to the website. I had to pay, and it was very expensive. I had to have an OT in every state, a company, and so it was very bureaucratic. In terms of bureaucracy alone, it would take us 6 months. And that's not to include the technical aspect. For a large operator, it would take 2, 3, 4 additional months. And then you had to talk to the Pope for the regional area, the Pope for Brazil, the Pope for the world, for us to have access available. Brisanet today has almost 250 towns provided with optic fibers. But we also have clusterings. I would have to use interconnection to remove this island so that my clients could call one another even though they used different telephone operators. So this is what we're doing with IX. We're trying to reestablish triple play in fixed telephone services and in their portfolio. I will be there with Alexandre, Elton, Claros, people, Tims, so that we can communicate with one another. Then you ask me, what is my interest in this? All small and large operators are within Oi's network, and in some cases in Brazil, Oi, because it's going through a failure process, sometimes discontinues its operation. So what will happen? Will my number speak to him? Will Tim speak to me? Will I be able to talk to you? No, it's all over. So we will go back to the island, and then we will need to have negotiations one by one. We will have to have a bipartite contract. Approach them one by one. Can you imagine it? I have Brisanet here. Pereira, the town of our headquarters, has 3 numbers, and if you want to talk to me, you would have to contact me via optic fibers. So this is what this service is going to do for us. Well,
14 years ago, I joined TPA, but the time of interconnection, we've reached 1 year and some months. Things have changed. But at the beginning of the operation, I opened more than 2,000 abnormality reports. So we carried out some work with some operators. And when we tried to perform the portability, and we were working with OI, they really did not support us. It was a manual process. And I was in charge of running that process. And I knew the number of numbers that had to go through this portability process. Then I met Fabio, and Fabio really helped us. So he talked to OI, and that really helped us. OI is one of the operators. And then in 2020, 2021, when we were just a local operator in the state of Santa Catarina, and then we expanded to the state of Rio Grande do Sul. Rio Grande do Sul, more than 1,000 municipalities. So 427 local areas. And that would be a huge work regarding gates, TDMs. So I talked to the upper management, and they said, first work with the cities in which we are already present. But then we won the 5G bid, and with that, I started saying that I wanted a SIP. Some operators felt that appealing, but not all of them. Some of them did not want competition. And once again, the Brazilian regulatory agency, Anatel, had to intervene in order to expedite the process. And in 1 year, we worked, and then from that point on, in 2024, we switched all the TDM routes to a SIP. So I came from IP and then moved back to TDM was a headache. I really did not understand TDM, cables, LX. It's a great confusion. And then when we ended the process, we really celebrated. But what I can tell you is that now we have simplification, lower costs, which is what we need. Let me try to understand. So you're already using CPIX. And just also to make it clear, the destination operator, it's mandatory that they participate in that, or do they have an option of not participating in that process? If the destination operator participates, things are much simpler. But we are now examining a case in which it's going to take, the entire process is going to take longer. But an IXP that participates, it may ask Brisa or Unific that so that they can deliver that to TIM, another operator. And of course, that depends on an agreement with the team, but I don't see any technical difficulty. Ideally, everybody would take part in the hub, and then you would not have issues regarding transportation. But that's not going to happen overnight. I also remember when the TV system changed, no system will be adopted and changed overnight. Luis, can you please comment as an association that gathers different wholesale companies and also providers. Can I use the term centralization, centralized? So how can we centralize the agreement? What was the word you used? Centralize, interconnection. No, but you do something else. You do what? Signaling. So what are the advantages of having that? And are you going to encourage that? So all members should take part in that in order to gain scalability and also accelerate the adoption of such initiative. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank CGI for the invitation. Everybody is silent. I was feeling cold up here, so then I had to get my jacket. I started in this area in 2008, and on my first day of work, Atelconca had Luis as a manager, and then when we talked about LGT, I understood the rationale of why we do have also the regulatory agency. Well, the agency needs to ensure interconnections. So when you had operator A and B, operator A with 90 customers and B with 10 customers, so 2 islands. So this 10 island can talk among themselves and the other 90 among themselves. If you don't make interconnection mandatory, you're going to see a monopoly because the other 10 customers from the operator B will switch to operator A. So that's why interconnection is so important. So the challenge of interconnection imposed by major players, be it by having red tape, bureaucracy, but in the past there was investment available. So we're talking about telco in 1899 and year 2000. We didn't have WhatsApp, we didn't have internet, we had nothing. This market changed a great deal. Today, the voice market is very important, especially in B2B. And when we discuss a hub, that emerged in different situations. So in 2003, there was an attempt, but there was always a conflict because agents wanted to be the internet exchange points. So perhaps, well, that prevented us from having something developed at that point in time when there was a lot of funds available. This discussion re-emerged, and 2 years ago, in the voice discussion of a group, this came up again. And Oi is the major IXP today, and because of its reorg and also with its migration for IP telephone. Of course, there are operators whose business is transportation. But as a principle, I'd say that we have a scenario in which this scenario is encouraged. So right now, we don't have much funds available. So Alton mentioned that he has to implement interconnections, but there are some municipalities in which you don't have enough funds for doing that. So we believe that we will still have transportation for mid-range agents and that we need to foster that initiative. So there are 70 members, different operations. There are some who see that as an opportunity. For some of them, this is a competition to their current business model, but it is into change, right? So it's like a Netflix when you still had the VHS rental stores. And Netflix changed the model, business model. So it's a trend to reduce costs and also to improve efficiency. Okay, so now let's talk to Anatel, the regulatory agency. So, Fábio, how does this work today, and how does this model, is this model allowed today or not? Do operators need to let Anatel know that they are taking part in this hub? So, what can you share about the regulatory aspects? Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you here at this auditorium, also those who are following us online. I'd like to commend the organizers and thank you for the invitation. Something I really enjoyed over these last 2 days is the presence of the academia. And going back to what you mentioned at the very beginning, we see so much transformation. And if we are discussing complex issues, it's because one day somebody taught us about that. So I'd like to thank the academia. I need to go back in time in order to share how regulations have also evolved. In preparing for this event, I went back to the RGI at the end of the 90s. And at that point in time, Rafael, there was so much certainty that even the interface and the connection on how it should look like was described. Even hierarchical channeling, minimum capacity, considering what was going on at that point in time. And today, that sounds really archaic, something you have at museums. So today, regulation is much more functional. It does not really, and it certainly can fit all the changes that are taking place. We have gone through technology development, and we have this coexistence of different worlds. One world that is born verticalized in telephone, and also another one that is born open. And this is very, very interesting to have all of us here discussing. And Brazil went over these changes, and there was no collision between the two worlds. We may have been very close, but today they coexist. And as I mentioned, considering, for example, the modernization of technologies of the incumbent companies. In the past, we talked about other systems. We witnessed many changes, but we've seen many interesting arrangements. And of course, we also need to consider how we have been able to solve concrete issues. But I also find very positive to see that based on the model that was really designed by other people in the past, without considering which agents had power and dominated that, and also the role of prescribing things. And we would need 5,000 points in the network, otherwise there would be no competition. So the atomization of this scenario was key so that small companies were able to have a minimum scale and access the system. Out of these 5,000, today we have 67 national codes, and this is how Brazil has worked on enumeration, but it's a more flexible and more functional system, and it allows us to provide a prompt response. So, being very objective, regulation now accommodates such changes, and we are ready if there is an issue regarding domain power or competition. So Anatel first ensures, well, first gives a license, right? Because the provider needs to be licensed at Anatel. And Anatel also plays the role of going over some commercial issues, but SIPX, Anatel does not actually act on SIPX. Is my understanding correct? For example, provider SIPX or the destination, origination destination. So, based on what I understood, when you think about the product solution, commercial solution, it should not be then submitted, or it should not depend on the approval of the agency. And there are different types of solutions. So I'm also very happy to say that Anatel, and we find this to be a value, but Anatel, for different kind of arrangements, we have always been agnostic. I prefer agnostic rather than neutral. I cannot test at first, right? So I am not going to prohibit any arrangement, but if it adds values to the market will then determine. And when you talk about domain and market power, then the agency acts in order to prevent any negative impact. I am asking you the question because Anatel has always acted on pricing of interconnections. So besides the 5,000 entry points, Anatel also monitored and worked on pricing so that newcomers could also provide their services. In that sense, it's still a direct negotiation between the provider and the destination company. So there will be no interference. If I can add to the point you just mentioned, perhaps when it comes to payment, we had a case in which we had a multi-ship, and Anatel intervened, and today that's no longer an issue. So just as an example, so today interconnections do not represent that companies will have more power. So you can have agreements, and with this, we will no longer need then the fixed services, and then the parties will then come to an agreement. Well, from the economic standpoint, as I mentioned, we do not want to be the middleman between companies. There are companies, just as Luis mentioned, that have been designed for doing that. But at the same time, they're also competitors because there is impact on the end user. So somebody's going to make use of a public service that also needs to be preserved. The idea is to simplify the process so that a complex operation implementation that has a cost that will have impact on the cost for consumers. Everything has a cost tied to it, but we want to reduce that impact in pricing for end users. So we are not charging for transportation. That is paid by the infrastructure that's made available to each participant. And there is freedom, and they can change that according to what they need. And how is that? How does pricing work? Well, at first, we just measured how much that's going to cost and how we're going to measure. So, for each participant to be able to send and receive calls. Because of some issues from participants, they asked us to charge based on minutes, because that's how they calculate also how services are provided. So it's easier, they said it's easier for us to approve it if it's charged based on the minutes. But the hub, for those who receive a call from the hub, there are no charges. Only once they call, then that's when they pay for that. I also decided to join this because all of us are tired of receiving a phone call in which nobody talks to you, and when you try to call them back, that number does not exist. So what we need to do is to give this industry the certainty that you will have a legit call. That's not, for example, a telemarketing, or that somebody, or if it's a fraud. And we need to control that. Why is that? Because let's say today I need to call the police or the fire department or the medical department, which has been an issue for some people because of OI. You need to trust that that system is going to work, and also that people can get in touch with me. And I need to make sure that if the community that makes use of that service is interested in that, well, that service should be always available. We know that AOTP services that compete with telephony companies. Well, but I'm not sure I understood. Are you talking about fighting spoofing and fraud? So can the system fight that, and how? Well, we fight spoofing by verifying the origin of that call. Who is that operator, if they are allowed to do that? But let's say if Brisa's client is calling a Unifique customer, we will check. And within Brisa, you may have a customer that may try to do spoofing. You can try to manage that, although this is not a part of the role of the hub. And spoofing is a major issue not only for consumers, but also for the operators, because the payment conditions is also affected. So let's say I have to pay a call from Brisa that was not actually generated by him. So the hub would not allow one operator to actually make a call with a number that does not belong to them. The same for transport. Okay, so now let me ask a question to the operators. So, Neilon and Elton. So, you two, you already have an agreement with companies. You have also the infrastructure to have the interconnection with other operators. And also now you have the opportunity to take part of the hub. So how does that work? So what about cost, and what is the synergy that produces? Well, the cost of an interconnection has been already established, and it has already been paid. So what I see today with the hub is a scenario which I'll have to expand with in Paraná with fibers. But perhaps that's not necessary. I may just work with a hub. Another scenario that I foresee is Resolution 777, which 100% of calls in Brazil will need to be authenticated. So I'll have to pay for a service. I have a local route, and now I have to pay a certain amount for a call to which I have cost zero. So I am very concerned with that, especially if you're a small player. There are also competitors from abroad. Let's say there are Brazilian companies that are authenticated, but not about those originated by companies that are not in Brazil. So we are now talking to Anatel about authentication, and there are some possibilities that are being examined. And I hope that Anatel uses the rule of having more than one vendor offering that service. That also enhances competition, and that will also allow us to decrease prices. Operators always want to pay the lowest price possible, and especially when it comes to telco, in which everything is paid in US dollars, although we are 100% Brazilian companies. But for other companies, everything is paid in USD. And we also need to consider 3GPP, and that also adds to the value. So when will all calls be authenticated? Starting 2027. So that's also the time frame for players to adjust. Is that correct? Yes. And which is the international vendor that you mentioned? Can I state the name? I think it's New Star, if I'm not mistaken. So it's are they using a proprietary technology? No. So, but there is nobody who can use this technology. But then they will have to establish the topology of the rules to see if any Brazilian vendor can also do that. But today we do have a company working that, right? I think that we should have more competition. The fact that you have just one vendor makes that a monopoly, right? Because then you depend on that. So you see as an option for the steel shake, for this technology that is being monopolized by one company. Well, steel shake is a topology that Anatel has established, but it's not proprietary. It does not belong to New Star. So the stay shaker was implemented in Brazil by ABR. And the company was hired for doing that. Stir shaken. So there was a request for proposal at the beginning of the implementation of stir shaken. I don't remember which companies took part in that, but only a single vendor had that. And what is being proposed here is that we have more people participating in that. So the steel shaker is just the authentication of the originator of the call. So as a consumer, if my bank used the steer shaken technology, I would feel more at ease about who is originating the call.
I wanted you to tell me about their plan to have a decentralized hub separated with all of the IXs in São Paulo, Fortaleza, and Rio. So, or the capital cities first. Well, our plan is not to have the same coverage, but of course, this has to be based on a collective interest. So, a telephone service provider, but the idea is to indicate where the provider accesses it to have access to the hub. Yes, and then in the net, you're part of it and you follow this movement. Whatever they inaugurate, the internet will follow behind. Yes, and in all of the northeastern states, yes. But today, for internet users to call Unific, I have to pay transportations for somebody. It is expensive, and consequently, we need technical support. So, in a concentration as proposed by our colleague, we have the facility with transportation, but also for the support of maintenance of this network. Well, I also wanted to go back to Elton. Ney mentioned about Oi. Did Unific feel or identify any problem, and how is this being solved? Well, actually, when we had a movement 2 years before with the Oi crisis, we already saw this happening, and we started doing this via SIP. So when we had the crisis at Oi, it was all established, and it was an easier scenario for us. And Unific benefited from it because Oi clients ended up at the Unific database. Yeah, a large part of it was TDM. We were one of the first to move on to SIP. It took a long time for it to be done, and once we left the market, my fear was regarding the three-digit services because a good part of these services were done by Oi. And basically, all of the management of this basis is or is related to Oi, and we have some demand going through to Anatel. We have to regulate the scenario, especially for the smaller ones. We have to identify what the right format is with Cadu. To this day, we receive emails to feed the base. In 2025, this is not feasible. And basically today we have somebody in Unific who checks email in our GLMC. So I'm sure that 100% of my bases is functional. But our main problem today is because we are a regional company. My client, who is in Santa Catarina today, will move to another region and use the three-digit. And this would be an important way to do it so that the hub is a three-digit hub. It would be very helpful. Instead of delivering to another operator for transportation, I would feel more confident and would deliver it directly with a conversion number at the point. We would be more confident because I would be 100% guaranteed that this is going to be delivered. My major pain is that some operators use a delivery format that is different from RNA4. And when the operator has a conversion format, I can use this for this type of service. When it's not available, I must have local interconnection or subcontract another operator. But the problem is, if the three-digit number does not work, I am the one who suffers and not the other operator, and therefore I prefer to guarantee that the call is going to be 100% reliably delivered. Feel free to ask questions, raise your hands, and the microphone will go around the room. You don't have to wait until the end of the panel to ask questions. I wanted to better understand about what you mentioned before, that the voice market is more and more corporate these days. I wanted to understand if after 2027, there is an expectation that this voice market will be resumed based on SPs, and if it will grow again as opposed to what we've seen in the past years. And is there any preparation that could have an impact on the model and on the connections? Well, Rafael, right now we're going through a very specific moment in 26, 27, where we see all of these movements, both in terms of the local areas, trying to obtain a convergence between services and the anticipated numbering condition for ICM, and also how the market will survive. But this is the beauty of it, where we can try different alternatives, as well as a portability regimen that will be instituted both for ICM services and also fixed services, enabling this legacy of the traditional fixed service to be left aside with the convergence to this product, which has demonstrated to be convergent from the very beginning. So we have this perspective for 27. You've seen different people commenting about it, about the influence that the different stakeholders could have, be it by the responsible entity or the work group. And I would like to invite everybody to participate, if not individually by means of the companies, because I know that resources are scarce and small enterprises do not allow that to happen, but also the representations, so that we can have a voice and an influence on the decision-making process. And now I'm communicating myself as a community, and a lot of what has been developed was based on this collaborative effort with debates and trying to obtain the best messages possible. Today, we have a provider, and we have people hired in the public service who are seeing with a different perspective. And more than that, dispute for the tickets, for the amounts, and those who have better potential will see how it happens. And you will see the market demand. And we have seen some interesting cases. And they accept the participation of public services. And if we are to talk to those who have designed it, this is unimaginable. And then this is how I celebrate the development of the industry, and in terms of growth, the adoption of robust solutions. Well, since you mentioned three digits, I will ask you about Oi, regarding the future of three digits and how it could help us solve this. Anatel has an inducing action so that we can adopt a hub model to facilitate the delivery of the 3 digits. And of course, the situation as is will, as of April 8th, I believe, will start a new process, including this portfolio. And it has some value, but it's important to say that in a complex process, we are maximizing values. And this market parcel will be alienated, and then we can see what the future is, and that will depend on the agent who takes over this operation and how relevant it is. And then the rest are speculations of different scenarios. So how can we see the industry? Because we've already seen this, and this is work being developed, and it includes management by Anatel with other entities and public services so that we can obtain alternatives. I will always pursue diversity, and I will always support this. Well, I imagine it, and there is an alternative that might contribute to something which is a little bit less painful, so that we can relax. Well, we have a question here from Domingos Barbosa. If you are an ASP and want to offer fixed telephone lines using connection to CPX, is it important for them to have it available so that you can obtain these number ranges? Well, for CPX, yes, they must have this license approved. Otherwise, I cannot approve their call. And this is how the regulation today in Brazil enables telephone services to be performed. As Fabio mentioned, in 27, they will not need to have a specific license. But until then, they will need to have a license. And it's also worthwhile calling your attention. I see the hub as an attempt to facilitate engineering solutions. You will have redundancy because the hub is expanded to other areas, but you must have Anatel, we have the bilateral agreements, and all of this remains. Also, we have a centralized traffic agreements, and if you have an agreement to simplify and a sectoral agreement in a hub, will make it easier for everybody. So you will access this agreement form. That makes our lives easier because telephone is still essential, but we must be efficient. We must also retrieve the trust we had. Nobody answers phone. There is a whole arrangement, a historic arrangement made, which provides basic services. So whenever you need help, you have to call the police. What do you use? You use a 900 number. But how can I call the police using WhatsApp? All of it must be taken into account as an evolution, as an opportunity we have. Perfect. This vision by Luis is very rich. The hub only created one facilitator for everything that could entail from all of this. We have the agreement which will reduce bureaucracy significantly because you have to sign an agreement with everyone, with 600 operators. So this is possible. It's good that it's written and regulated so that we do not have any doubts. For 3 digits, But it's not solved just because of our own willingness. We are facilitators. We are technological facilitators, but not of regulatory interference. We can contribute as any of us here, but the fact is that we have technology available for this process. We are competent to help, to give an opinion, but it's important to make it clear that the hub is one alternative. It's not the alternative. The idea is to do something collective, collaborative, to help everyone, citizens, users, service providers. Rafael, I will ask a question, and I want to clarify this and perhaps complement Anderson's question. As of 2027, those who have an SCM license will be able to have the numbers available. I wanted you to comment for the providers. What will happen? What do they have to do? What changes for them so that they can start rendering this service? I can start. To recover this a little bit, this is very intuitive, and a lot of it is based on the idea that the traditional telephone system carried a very heavy burden of the structure I mentioned. It's very vertical, defined with all of the different numbers, and it went against these fluid concepts. What have we done? We are offering this relevant universe, a public number range. It's interchangeable, and we will go from N9 to N1, the 9 digits of an addressable number starting with N96, and we can even have portability. It is a condition, a new condition, which is available to ensure an effective interoperability, even in an established network, in a very practical way. So if you do not want to replicate the same rigid structure of SPC, you will be able to have except from numbers 6 and 9, a whole series of numbers for the corporate market, especially for those who like having a fixed number. So it's one other option that is offered to the market, and we do not intend to elect a winning approach or separate it between winners and losers, but offering it to the Brazilian market as it presents itself as one additional alternative to our consumers. In this SCM scenario, a lot of people think that opening a USCN operation will be different. For me, it is the same. You will have to have an interconnection. An SCM will have to be interconnected to the large ones, and they will have to do it directly. And the main legacy of a UFC operator is knowing that the plan is open for all operators and is receiving the calls. But I do think that in this portability scenario, this will be a complicating factor, because today it is related to the corporate tax ID. And if you have a small business, clients already know about this number. And clients who dialed N8 will have to dial N9. And then after some time, they will try to dial 6 or N8. And then if the call doesn't go through, what do you do? Who do you talk to? You will have to open a complaint order with the operator. But I think that Anatel should review this. And I also think that we should maintain the SCM plan for the incoming operators who would use the current UFC, and they would open portability as we do today. And the main aspect here is the invoicing of the operators or physical persons is going down, but for legal entities, it's going up. And this is where is the traffic of physical persons going to? I think that if we opened one opportunity to reuse numbers in an operator, like as in an ACM operator, we would be able to do this, and we wouldn't have this gap for the range with the numbers and all of these factors. So the connection aspect could be corrected later on and even expanded. And in the future, we would open it up for everybody using the N6 to all of the SCFs. And people say SCM, but nobody knows how many will be requested. We don't know what the actual demand is going to be. So basically, this is something we don't know, but we're not asking ourselves. So have you tried to use SAM connection? And with my contact, I tried to talk to my contacts, and nobody has confirmed it. Well, I will go back to the prior question. This was a question for everyone. Do you expect to resume it? It's very relevant, and we have the distribution of the numbers. So what is the main thing? It has grown because of B2C. I will migrate to B2B because there is a larger margin, and it's not B2B. It is structured in a different way. I do think that there is an expectation, like people will say, okay, I'm going to start working in the telephone market, telephone communications market. But we have to consider this option. I see some anxiety by some companies to offer telephone services, telecommunication services, because there's churn involved. There is a business strategy behind it in their area. They have to talk to their municipality with 3 digits. So they start working in the region they operate. I see demand that we must have a well-structured communication because we will have requests for interconnection. And will we have enough capacity to accept it? Because in a hub, you can create an agreement to facilitate this demand. And all of this has to be discussed.
Now I'd like to hear from the operators. So what they expect to have more providers? Actually, BrisaNet has the entire technology ready with everything, with tier 3 CPDs. So today, BrisaNet has many in the Northeast, and in order to enhance security, you also need a physical device. It's not only a matter of having a VPN. When you think about voice frauds, 80% of frauds, they come from using voice. And this is why we need to really improve the security system. So BrisaNet is investing on
É o
that.
modo de operandes da BrisaNet ter
This is
vários
how we
CPDs em
actually
edge
operate,
calling,
so
né?
to have
A
many
BrisaNet já tem
CPDs and
isso,
edge
e aí já está
computing,
se
and we
preparando para
have
toda essa
that, and
movimentação
we
do
are
mercado.
getting ready for this
Queria,
market
nós vamos todo
change.
mundo
Now, I'd like
base no que
just
o
to
Luiz já
ask a
falou,
question to all
a
of you
respeito
based on
do
what
resgate
Luis
da
mentioned.
confiança na
It's
voz,
how to
né, na telefonia. A
rescue
gente viu
trust
serviços
in
distintos
voice
crescendo
systems
bastante,
when it
tirando,
comes to
roubando
phone
bastante
calls.
do cliente do mercado de telefonia tradicional. A gente tem os aplicativos,
Because today we have
mesmo com voz
apps
assíncrona,
and
todo mundo manda
WhatsApp, even
mensagem
with
de voz, às vezes
asynchronous
até do que
messages. So
ligar
many
e chamar.
people prefer to
Enfim,
send a
vocês
voice message
imaginem,
rather
a
than
partir de
calling
2027, mas
the
esse tema
person.
de
So
numeração,
starting
com iniciativas que
2017,
facilitem essa conexão,
2027, with
a gente
enumeration, with
consiga ter uma
initiatives that will
oferta de
then
voz que seja mais atraente para o consumidor,
improve
para daí a
security.
voz
We will have
reconquistar além da
options
autenticação,
for
né, da diminuir as
consumers.
fraudes, esse tipo de
And
coisa.
we also have
É
authentication
possível
that will
reconquistar
decrease
o
the number
consumidor
of
para usar
frauds.
os
So do you
serviços
think we
tradicionais de
will
voz na telefonia.
regain
Queria que todo
consumers to
mundo
go
pudesse
back to
opinar, por
voice
favor.
calls, traditional voice
Hoje no
calls?
cenário está difícil você concorrer com o OTT.
Today, it's
Porque hoje
really
você tem
difficult
voz no
for you to
Instagram, você tem
compete
voz no
against
FaceTime, você
OTT
tem
because
voz
you
em todo
have a
lugar. Você
voice in
manda áudio.
every single app.
Então
You
o
can send
mercado
a
está
voice
enxergando
message.
uma outra
So the
vertente de
market
exploração,
now
que é o
sees
B2G,
another
o
means, which is
governo, que é o B2B
B2G to
para as
the
empresas
government, which
e
is to
pequenos negócios.
B2B
Então o
to
mercado de voz ele está apurado ali, com
business.
um fluxo maior,
So
e que uma
we are
empresa que tem
focusing on
saque, que
that.
tem atendimento, que tem uma
And a
televenda,
company
que
with
tem
a customer
algum plano
service or
recebimento dessas demandas a não ser por aplicativo.
uh,
E
phone
ainda
call
está debaixo
sales.
da inteligência artificial, né?
And we also have
Então,
to
o que que acontece com
consider
a voz? A
the
voz,
role
ela vai
played by
entrar num
AI.
conjunto, eu estava comunicando aqui junto, estava conversando com o Alexandre
I was
e
talking
também com o
to
Elton,
Alexandre and
mas
also
um
with
problema que vai
Elton.
acontecer, por exemplo, você ligar numa
We
central
believe
telefônica
that there will
e
be
um
a
agente
problem.
de
You
voz
are
vai
gonna
assistir muito
call
na resolução
a
do seu
number
problema.
and an
E é
agentic
característica do
AI
agente.
will
Eu
really
quero
insist
falar com alguém
in
para resolver o
solving the
problema.
problem. But the human beings, they
Então,
want to
a
talk to
voz, ela
another
vai estar
human being.
atrelada
So
a isso.
voice
Uma
will
empresa
be
vai ter que ter
tied
uma
to that.
característica de
A
IA,
company
mas digite 9 para falar com o
may have
atendente,
AI, but they should also have a
né?
press
Então,
9
a
to talk
voz ela
to
está
a human
atribuída para o
agent.
atendimento da BrisaNet muito mais
So
um
to
mercado
us,
repetitivo de chamadas do que
voice
com
is
ativo.
more
Com ativo
related
você pode criar
to
agentes, você pode criar
these
agendamentos, você
calls
pode
that are
criar
received.
campanhas na rede de voz
Otherwise,
e
you
tudo
can
mais.
do some other
Mas
activities,
no
especially
recepcionador
in
vai ser
regard
muito
to
mais atrativo.
telemarketing.
No
But
caso de pedir
voice will be
toda
very
no
important
caso de
when a
negociar
phone
toda essa
call
atitude.
is
E aonde que está a
received.
receita? É isso que eu deixo a pergunta aberta para vocês.
And
Então,
where is
a
the
gente tem que
revenue?
apurar, tem que trabalhar
So
no
we
meio
need
de telecomunicações, no meio de
to
voz, como
work on voice
autenticação,
for
né?
telco, and
Como
we need to work
recuperar
on
a confiabilidade.
authentication. Why did
Hoje
we
você tem 8
lose
ligações no meu celular.
trust? Today, I received 8 phone
Ligações
calls on
alô,
my cell
alô,
phone, but
alô, ninguém sabe
mute
quem,
phone calls.
né?
So
Então,
you
autenticação
answer,
tudo
hello,
feito
nobody
para você
answers
ligar e
back.
falar.
So we
Essa ligação
need
é da BrisaNet,
to
ela está com o logo da
actually
BrisaNet e tem um
increase
RFID check
credibility. You
para ter
need to
autenticação.
have
Mas
an
às vezes eu uso esse
authentication,
meu tom de
something
voz
that
para
says, well,
falar,
this
para
is
enganar,
from
para
BrisaNet.
pegar
But
as
we
piores
know that
mentalidades. E
bad
a
guys,
gente de IA
they
que está
make
capturando
use of
tom da
that
sua
for
voz e fazendo
frauds. And
frases
there
com o tom da
is
sua voz e
AI
pedindo
that
dinheiro
can
para sua
capture
mãe.
your voice, and then they will
Então a
send a
gente tem que ter
message to
cuidado
your
com isso.
mom asking
A
for
agência
money.
trabalhar, né, nessa ferramenta de
So it's
autenticação,
important
ver uma
that the
forma de
agency
aplicação,
works on
deixando a
authentication, that they
viabilidade do
think
produto
about
também.
an app, and also
Como o Elton
consider the
falou,
product
editor,
feasibility.
3GPP,
3GPP,
SMP, é coisa de
SMP,
milhões
STFC, this
é
costs
caro. Então, para a
millions.
gente
It's very
retomar
expensive.
esse valor,
So in
aumentar
order
a ARPA, aí
to
todo esse
think
dinheiro ele vai
about
repassar ao consumidor final.
value and
Então, a gente
how
tem que
not to
pensar
pass
numa
on this
forma
cost to
de
end
fazer sim
consumers.
regular,
So we do
não
need to
só,
regulate.
Casote, para voz, SMS também, né?
Also,
A gente tem brokers
we
que
have
recebem
brokers
autenticações de 2 fatores, que mandam SMS para
that
você.
are
Olha, tu fez aqui um
authenticated by two factors and they send a
uma
message
compra
to
no seu
you. They
cartão do
say,
Nubank de
oh,
3.942 reais.
there
Uma
is a
pessoa que ganha um
purchase
salário mínimo
being
nosso
made
vai ver
by
que caiu,
you
né? Ele vai clicar lá no
using your
0800,
credit
ele
card.
já
But
está ali,
imagine
crava o
if
0800 dele da
it's not
mensagem do
you, but
SMS,
then
o
in the
aplicativo do
SMS
mercado pula
message,
e já faz a chamada
there
automática.
should be a tie so
Então,
that the person
é um
can
apelo para a gente
call
também. Isso é
immediately.
um
So this is the ideal world for us. So, and also the active part of voice phone calls to have authentication. So non-centralized. So you have an agency, but what is the tier of that agency? How do you support that? These are my questions. So what about this vendor? Is this company going to support all voice calls? So today, BrisaNet, we have 4,500 voice calls at the same millisecond, and we are a small company. Think about all the other major operators. Another point, three-digit. What's the risk? To leave an essential work if you have a three-digit. If you don't call 190, do you know who is to blame for that? It's not the police. It's not the police central unit. No, I called the police or the fire department to say if they didn't answer that emergency. The operator will be blamed, and this is why this needs to be regulated and also should be financially feasible.
Só para vocês terem uma ideia, tem a pesquisa de satisfação do cliente da
Well, Anatel has the
é a primeira colocada.
User
O que acontece
satisfaction survey. What happens with companies such as us?
Provavelmente muitos dos nossos clientes vão lá e abordam a gente.
When we are out in the market, many consumers come and they talk to us. Well, actually, when you go to the supermarket, people come and talk to us. They say, oh, my neighbor suffered a fraud. Unific started to block robocalls, so call centers calling, and the customer would really complain about it. I'm receiving too many calls. So we added a free of charge service. So call us and we will block that number. Like that. We did that, and by doing that, we decreased the number of complaints. But then when we moved to SMP, everything started again. And that's why now we are implementing a platform. I'm calling it SW6. It will validate at RN1 and also control general blacklist and individual blacklist. So when Anatel actually listed major blockers, it actually got in our way because we were doing that. We were offering that kind of service. And that would also add value to our customers. But we will redo that because we find that very appealing to our customers. I was talking to Nelon. I received the 3 spam phone calls, and I believe that our customers also receive the same number of spam calls. So now let's wait to see how the agency will authenticate that. Well, they should not receive these phone calls, right? I was thinking about it and about my final considerations. Yeah, I saw that you reacted when he talked about SMS. So is there something related to that? I find our industry very beautiful, so dynamic. So when I was attending high school, I had to write a paper. It was about the Iridium project. It failed. It was the number of satellites that would give the atomic number of a chemical element. And today there are so many that we talk about constellations. When I finished that, we had software defined by some other elements. And things evolve. And they certainly reflect what's going on. So when you talk about voice connection, to me, trustworthiness and to salvage that is very important. Even as competitive edge, right? And Anatel is counting on the support of the entire industry. For example, verified origin. So first, this was done by companies joining that effort, but today that is compulsory. So we need to discuss how should we scale that up if there are a diversity of agents, and if that decreases the scale, well, we need to discuss all that. Earlier, we discussed the ACS platform. So what is the optimum level? Everything needs to be discussed. And as for SMS, although this is not much used in Brazil, involving diplomats, that people outside Brazil that had to talk to their families here, and they were not able to receive the message because of two-factor authentication. So this is not used in person-to-person communication, but and there are so many other apps. And telecom industry from the very beginning carries a value of trust, right? And that needs to be used as a competitive advantage. We need to think about reliability. So, for example, for a bank transaction, we still rely on SMS for the bank sending us, for example, a ping or something like that. Now, please, final remarks. Let's start with the Sirota. So how can we regain trust? I was thinking while you were discussing, and unfortunately, I'm an engineer, but phone calls is Greek to me. So when you talk about interconnection, when you use all the acronyms, forget about it. I need ChatGPT in order to understand what's being said. It's very, very different from the internet world, which is much simpler. At least this is how I see it. Perhaps you'll find what I do and what we do more complex. And
essa questão de retomada de confiabilidade aí de serviço de voz.
About regaining trust. I agree with you that I receive 100,000 Brazilian reals by messages sent to me asking me to click on something. But anyway, SM messages, they work. But for my children, this is like a computer. They are on Wi-Fi all the time, and they have no idea about what a voice call is. Forget about SMS. And they are in their 30s. They're not children. I think that the scenario is much worse for children. So, to me, this is dead when it comes to phone call. I don't answer any phone call unless it's somebody who I know, but them, they use WhatsApp. The major question I have is, How
né?
is the
Porque quem está
system
gerando todas essas ligações que eu não atendi?
sustainable?
Ou se eu
Who is
atendo,
generating
alguém faz
all phone
pedido,
calls that I don't answer
por que
to,
que isso
or that
não
are, when I answer, there's
continua
nobody on the other
acontecendo?
end?
Economicamente,
From the economic
fica custeando
standpoint,
tudo isso.
somebody's paying for that, right?
Bom, eu acho que esse debate se insere nessa discussão de soberania que a gente
I
tanto fala
believe
hoje.
it's a
Nós
matter
somos
of
dependentes agora para a
sovereignty.
voz de uma empresa que sequer é regulada.
Today, we depend on a
Está na
company
telefônica
that
do
is
mundo.
not even regulated and it's on everybody's
Tem uma
cell phone.
oportunidade aqui de
I see an
simplificar
opportunity
em um hub,
to
um CPI
simplify with a hub, as I mentioned,
repensar esses
SIPX,
processos,
and then
simplificar.
to
E acho que tem
go
diversas
over the
iniciativas, Código
processes again. And there are
Desenvolve,
many
IPTV+,
initiatives.
o
Which
Steer Shake,
company is calling
autenticação,
me? Steer
tem um monte de
shaking,
iniciativa para
authentication. There are
retomar a
many
credibilidade de algo que é
initiatives
fundamental na
in
vida das
order to
pessoas,
regain
em muitos dos processos
trust.
de negócios, né?
That's
O
important for
Neylon falou de
business.
serviço ao governo,
Nylon
não só o
talked
B2B.
about government,
Então, assim, enquanto associação,
not only
somos esperançosos de
B2B.
empurrar essa agenda
And we
como uma
want to
solução
push
para vários
this
dos nossos problemas
agenda
aí
forward in
do
order
dia a
to
dia. Então,
solve
obrigado pela
many of our
oportunidade aí
day-to-day
de participar
issues.
dessa
So
conversa.
thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here. Well, Rafael, I'd like to close by thanking the organizers for the invitation.
Mas brincadeiras à parte, eu queria enfatizar essa mensagem de perspectiva regulatória agnóstica, no sentido
I'd
de
like to
acomodar,
once
permitir
again
e
stress
reservar o mercado à
agnostic
escolha daquela que for
regulatory
mais adequada
approach
à necessidade da
and to
demanda
find what works
da
best
operação
based on the
brasileira.
demand
Obrigado.
in Brazil.
Também queria agradecer
I'd like to
CPX
thank
e o IX.br pelo
CPX
convite.
and NIC.br for the
O
invitation.
cenário da telecomunicações está crescente
The
e
scenario
acho que o novo
is
cenário
really
seria
booming in our
praticamente, eu
industry.
sou defensor de usar
I
a DSL
advocate
própria aqui no Brasil.
for
Já tenho
using
comentado
our
com eles.
own
E como uma
RS,
empresa nacional,
and as
poder
a
duas
Brazilian
aqui,
company. There
sou
are two
defensor
of
sempre de
us
usar
here.
soluções nacionais.
I really
Uma
advocate for
solução seria o
using
RCS nacional,
Brazilian
que seria
solutions,
muito
and one of
adequado
them
para
is to
participação de
use
tráfego hoje de
Brazilian
voz,
CRS, because when you
mensagem
think
direta
about
com uma empresa, um vendedor fora do país.
what is
RCS,
used
acho que daria,
today, they lie in the
durante até
hands of
a
foreign
agência poderia
companies.
até fomentar isso ou ir até
Perhaps the Brazilian
ia
agency
conseguir
Anatel could also
gerenciar isso de
foster
forma
that
mais
and allow
segura,
us to manage that
até em casos de judiciais, porque
with
seria muito
greater
fácil para
security,
uma empresa de fora do país essa parte de judicialização. Mas agradeço,
especially when you
fico à
think about the
disposição para
presence
qualquer
of
coisa que
foreign
tiver dúvida
companies
depois.
now operating
Obrigado pelo
in our
convite,
market.
né?
Well,
Obrigado a todos os
thank you for the
participantes
invitation.
e
I'd like to thank all
vamos esperar.
participants.
Obrigado também à Anatel de ter
I'd
ajudado a
like to
tirar a
thank
interconexão do CMR e
Anatel
colocar para o CN, viu?
for also going
E o
back to
SIC também,
CM
obrigado,
and
obrigado
also
mesmo pela causa.
SIP.
E
Thank
obrigado a
you.
todos os
And
participantes
thank you all for joining
obrigado
us
a todo
this
mundo.
afternoon.
Queria agradecer aqui ao Ney
I'd like to thank Ney for giving us the opportunity to be here, Rafael for mediating this conversation. I'd like to thank you for joining us. And just as Luis mentioned, I'd like to go back to sovereignty. In many countries, they do not allow foreign companies to take part in this scenario. So I'd say that it's very important to give opportunities to Brazilian companies. And as for regaining trust, that's something that will happen by joining our efforts and also with regulation. And we need to think about, for example, for the messages, the fraudulent messages that we receive, right? Once again, thank you very much.
Por e-mail aqui após o evento no Coffee Break agora. Obrigado.
É isso, gente.
Thank you.
Obrigado.
We can
Vamos ao
also
coffee
talk
break,
during
então.
the coffee break. Okay, so let's break for coffee now. Thank you very much.
Opa.
Vamos retomar aqui as atividades do IX
So
Forum
we're going to resume the
Fortaleza
activities of the
2026.
Fortaleza
Dando
IX
prosseguimento para
Forum
nossa programação, eu queria convidar
26.
o William
And
Prado,
moving on, I would like to
IX.br,
invite
da
William
equipe do
Prado
IX.br,
from
vai falar
the
sobre o
IX.br
Source
team.
of
He
Truth
will
para
talk
data
about
centers.
routing source of truth for data centers.
Bom, pessoal, boa tarde a todos.
Good afternoon, everyone.
É um prazer estar aqui no IX Forum
It is a
Fortaleza,
pleasure to be here
essa
at the
oportunidade de
Fortaleza
apresentação.
X
Vou
Forum.
falar um pouquinho sobre
I
automação de
will
redes.
talk a little bit about network automation. And for those of you who do not know me, I work with engineering. And in the last 5 years, I have focused on working with network automation and solutions for network automations.
De uma forma um pouco mais curiosa,
And
uma
today, I have
nova aqui para o
a
mercado
new
brasileiro.
tool for the Brazilian market.
Então, antes até de começar a apresentação,
And so even before I start my presentation, I wanted to ask the audience a question regarding NetBox. Do any of you use it on your day-to-day? Are you familiar with an Autobot and do you use it?
Alguém conhece? Alguém
InfraHub, is anybody familiar with it? Okay, cool.
da apresentação,
So throughout my presentation,
não falado no Autobot? E por que falado o InfraHub?
and so why not talk about
E durante a apresentação eu vou tentar explicar o
Autobot?
motivo disso.
During my presentation, I will try to explain why, because it is a different tool from NetBox and Autobot.
Vamos lá. Deixo aqui também meu e-mail.
I will also leave my email here. Usually when I make a presentation, I always receive questions and emails, so please feel free to send me messages with your questions. It'll be a pleasure to answer them. So we have an agenda here of what it is going to be like during my presentation. I will tell you a little bit about InfraHub, what company develops it, how it came about, and why it is a different tool when compared to NetBox. Somebody raised their hands, but we will talk a little bit about its architecture. It's important to understand how it works. I will also contextualize a little about the challenges we face in the management of the infrastructure, both physical infrastructure for data centers and enterprises, as well as the logic aspect, network automation. And then I will talk about how they can help us face the challenges we have on the day-to-day. So I will talk about how we can communicate with the tool. It is called GraphQL. And I will talk about generators and schema. In the end, I will share some images with the installed tool to give you an example. So at the end of the day, what is InfraHub? It is a source of truth platform, and it is a new generation tool developed by OpsMill, which combines infrastructure data management with the control of native versions of modern APIs and integrated automation. So you can tell me, hey, William, I use NetBox and I have installed NetBox branching. Is it the same thing? No, it is not. NetBox developed a plugin, whereas in InfraHub, it already started with native bits, and they will be available without us having to do anything, without depending on plugins. So it's less complicated. And it started native with a Git. So that's why I call it Git native. InfraHub has integrated automation. When it started, it didn't have integrated automation, but the system was developed to provide for the needs of DCSM and IPAM.
tempos atrás usava muito
Some
Excel
people
para
ago, people used a lot of Excel,
surgiu dessa demanda.
but
E ele não
NetBox
tinha
came
automação
because of
nativa
this
ali, né?
demand.
Então você precisava desenvolver scripts
You
e tudo mais
needed
para conseguir
to
usar a
develop
parte de
scripts to
automação
be
mais
able
a
to
NetBox.
use
O
automation
InfraHub ele já
plus
nasce com isso
NetBox.
nativo. Então você consegue
InfraHub
no próprio
has this
InfraHub colocar
native.
automações para
In
rodar no
InfraHub,
ambiente, sem
you can
precisar de nada
automate it to
externo.
run without
Outro ponto
requiring
muito
the
importante é o
external team.
GraphQL, né?
Another
Do
important
InfraHub,
thing is
diferente do
GraphQL.
Xbox e do
As
Autobot,
opposed
ele não
to
tem REST API, ele só usa o
out-of-box,
GraphQL.
it does
Depois eu
not
vou também
have
explicar o motivo dessa decisão que a gente
APIs.
conseguiu ter, que
And
eu acho
later,
muito
I
assertivo,
will
inclusive,
explain
né?
why.
Então, a gente, para consumir esses
So,
dados do InfraHub, é
to
apenas
use
usando o GraphQL.
InfraHub data, we
E
need
acho que para
to
mim a cereja
use
do bolo aí, que
GraphQL.
faz dele ser totalmente
And the
diferente
cherry on
do que
top of
funciona
the
no Autobot,
cake
o InfraHub,
cake
ele é
here is
schema
that
driven. Então,
InfraHub
percebe?
is schema
Quando você
driven.
precisa criar um modelo
So
de dados
when we need to
para atender
create
uma
a data
demanda da
model
empresa
to
que você
meet a
trabalha dentro,
demand
que
of the
você opera,
company you work at,
você mesmo pode criar esse
you
esquema usando o
yourself
YAML file.
can
Então,
create
hoje, quando a gente
this
vem falar um pouquinho do
schema
Autobox e no
using
Autobot,
the
quando
YAML
você
file.
precisa personalizar algo que não
When
tem
you
no,
need to
no
personalize
Netbox, por
something
exemplo,
which is not
você
available in
precisa fazer
NetBox, for
um plugin.
example, what do you have to do?
Utilizar um plugin que alguém da comunidade disponibilizou. Resolve? Resolve. Porém, você
Does
acaba
it solve the
criando
problem?
dependências
Yes, it does,
específicas
but you
no
end up
momento que
creating
você, por exemplo, faz uma atualização do
some
Netbox.
level
Eu
of
vejo na
dependence.
comunidade diariamente
And I
pessoas
see the community on
criando
a daily
Netbox e
basis
falando
that
lá,
people
eu tenho um
updating that
plugin aqui que
box, and then
colocou
they
valores
say, well, I
incorretos.
have a
Por quê?
plugin,
Porque o plugin
it's
ele foi
stopped
desenvolvido por um
working
terceiro,
because the
não foi desenvolvido
plugin
pelo
was
Netbox.
developed by a
E
third
aí esse
party and
plugin não
not
tem essa
by the
responsabilidade
NetBox
de manter
team.
esse plugin
And they
atualizado.
do not have the
Então, aqui no
responsibility to
InfraHub,
keep the
você vai
plugin
criar esse esquema usando o YAML
updated.
file
So
e
you
você
will
tira essa
create
dependência de plugin. E óbvio que quando você fala em plugin, você
the
precisa ter o
system
conhecimento
without
de desenvolvimento.
depending
No
on a
caso do
plugin.
Netbox e do Autobot,
In the
os
case of
sistemas
NetBox and
utilizam Django, né,
Autobox,
como um
both
framework
platforms
para
use Django as a
desenvolvimento da
framework
ferramenta
for
mesmo.
the
Então, se
development
você vai
of the
desenvolver um
tool.
plugin, por
And then
exemplo, para o
if you
Netbox ou para o
develop a
Autobot,
plugin,
você precisa entender desse framework.
you need to
Aqui no
understand
InfraHub isso é
this
totalmente diferente.
framework.
Basta você
This
criar
is
um YAML
totally
file,
different here.
que eu vou mostrar logo a
You
seguir,
all
e
you
aí
have
você
to
já
do is
consegue criar
create an
esses
YAML file,
esquemas
and then
personalizados e
you can
atender a
create
demanda que
these
você tem ali,
schemas.
sem
They are
precisar nada de
personalized, and
entender
you
de
can meet
desenvolvimento de
your
software, por
demand
exemplo. Então, é um
without
ponto
having to
muito
develop
que
software.
chama muito a atenção.
It calls a lot of attention.
Então, a arquitetura do InfraHub
The architecture of
é
InfraHub
interessante
is very
porque o front-end
interesting.
do InfraHub
The
ele
front
é desenvolvido
end
em
of the
React
InfraHub
e o
is
back-end
developed
do
with a
InfraHub
React.
ele é
The back
Python com
end
GraphQL.
is Python
Qual que é a
with
diferença aí?
GraphQL.
Ele é todo
What
modular.
is the difference
Quando
here?
você
It's
compara ele
very
com o
modular.
Netbox, com o
When you
Autobot,
compare it to
ambos usam
NetBox and
sistemas de Django.
Autobox,
Então, você tem
both
que
of
seguir
them
cada um
use
fazendo
the
outra
same
coisa. Aqui é tudo
standard.
separado.
But
Por
here
quê?
it's all
Então, se
separate
você
and
olhar para o front-end
segmented.
do InfraHub
So
e
if you
falar,
look at the front
eu não
end
gostei
of
desse sistema
InfraHub,
aqui,
you will say,
você
oh, I
pode
don't
desenvolver o
like it.
seu
Well,
na
you can
linguagem que você
develop your
quiser
own
e
with
você vai
whatever
conseguir os
language you
dados do
want to
back-end
use,
ali usando o
and you
GraphQL.
will use
Essa é
the
a regra.
graph and
É
data.
diferente também
This
das
is the
outras
rule.
plataformas,
It's
eles não
different from
utilizam
other
dados,
platforms.
banco de
They do
dados
not
relacional,
use
como tem,
traditional
por exemplo, no
database.
relacional. O InfraHub utiliza um
InfraHub
banco baseado em grafos,
uses
que faz toda a
graph-based
diferença aí na hora de importar os esquemas, de ter essa parte mais
databases
dinâmica aí dos dados, né?
so that you can
Então,
have
quando
more
tem todo esse
dynamic data.
back-end ali já,
It
né,
is
nativo, ele tem
created
todas
or
as definições
developed
também para
with
você criar as automações para rodar na ponta.
native
Então, é muito poderoso.
characteristics.
E,
It is
obviamente, ele
very
tem integração com
powerful.
qualquer
And
outro
of
sistema
course,
lá
it
de
is
monitoramento.
integrated to
Se
any
você quiser
system.
integrar com outro bit
Monitoring. If you want
para
to
conversar
integrate it with
script
another
ou qualquer
bit
outra coisa que você
for
precisar, você pode fazer essa
anything
integração.
that you
Se
may
for
need,
script Python,
you
tudo é integrado
can
aqui.
use the script
Então,
Python, everything that
é
is
bem interessante
integrated. It's
essa
very
visão sobre a
interesting.
arquitetura do InfraHub.
And I will tell you
Então,
a
quando a
little
gente
bit
fala em
about the
desafios
InfraHub
de
architecture.
gestão,
Whenever we
a
talk
gente
about
poderia ficar até amanhã
challenges,
conversando, né? Existem
we could
muitos desafios.
speak forever
Inclusive,
about
em
this.
dezembro,
There are many
a gente
challenges
bateu aqui uma
involved.
apresentação falando um pouco sobre
In
NetDevOps,
September, we talked a little
trazendo
bit
a
about
operação de rede
NetDevOps with
tradicional, né?
operations
A forma
in
como a gente
traditional
aprendeu a rede com
networks
command line
and the way
interface,
we learned
e
how
essa
to
nova
operate the network
forma de se operar a
with
rede,
this new
e a gente vê
way
que o
of
mercado vai para esse
operating the
lado, né? Ele vai voltar para
network. And we can
automação,
see
que é
the
ter a infraestrutura
it going this way. And the network is designed with YAML file, you know, different files But when we establish the architecture to deal with this for automation, we should keep in mind when we make our decision what tools can help us solve certain problems. And what is most important here is that I always see people making decisions thinking about today. But what about tomorrow? What about the company you work for? Today we have 10 pieces of equipment. So how can you offer all of it? Is the tool you use today prepared for this type of growth? So the idea of having InfraHub here is to open up our minds. We know that there are other tools that can help us with the solutions for some problems. We have IP management, VLANs, monitorings, data centers, cables, racks, the occupation of the racks. All of this is a huge challenge for management. And I don't see a way out other than using a tool like this. And of course, changing the whole process with this operation. We still see a lot of companies going to the field and then documenting. So the idea is to change our minds a bit. Start a project, start everything based on truth, and then you start generating other things, automation, scripts, with all of the required application. And now talking a little bit about InfraHub, what can it do to help us with these challenges? First, data version. How can it help us in our day-to-day operations? Those who work with network operations and equipment, you can see different setup and you will ask yourselves, who has done this? And then when time comes, you want to solve it, but has anybody done anything different? We ask ourselves, why, when, what was it like before, what is it like now? Usually these questions have no answer. But when we start working this way with network operation, as we do with a software operation, we will understand why we're making changes. We will have somebody to review what you're trying to implement in the network to make sure you're not adding a wrong setup. In InfraHub, this is all native, and it helps us. We have a trackability of what we're changing in the network. Then we have native features. You can use the bit ops aspects in a very simple manner. Another functionality, it is very interesting, and it has to do with what we call artifacts. Artifacts are a functionality available in the tool where you can generate a file. This file can be in any format, Python, CFG, a setup file, a startup, a JSON, XT, whatever you choose. And you can use the InfraHub data with all of the documentation, and you will consume data. You will have a render there. Usually we use Ginger to design the format, and then you can have a setup file.
For example, let's say you want to implement 10 pieces of equipment. You go to InfraHub, you enter the information, and then Artifacts will generate the final file so that you can just copy and paste, or if you want automated, you can just access and have the initial configuration. So Artifact is broadly used. Here you have an example, a template of Ginger, so that you work with the information coming from InfraHub. And of course, you will need an API. You need to consume data using GraphQL. And finally, you have your final file. We also have generators, and this functionality is very interesting. Generators is an internal automation of the tool. So based on an event, you can do about anything. So let's say you created a new document and then, or a new piece of equipment rather. There are many things that need to be recorded. So usually people go to IPAM, check for the IP, check every screen. But if you use generators, so once you create an event of a device that was created, it will then get an IP and it will associate with an interface. So you can use generators for implementing business rules and also to really automate many activities. This is extremely useful, and we see people broadly using generators. It's very useful in your day-to-day operation. And finally, we have a schema. As I mentioned, we have the possibility of developing personalized schemas without having that development skill, without having to really know Python. So we have an example here when you have an YAML file for a device, and then there are some attributes such as name, also what type of platform. You enter this of what you want to develop, and then you can also establish relationships. So let's say I want to create an interface schema or a device schema. So any equipment in the network presents interfaces, and interfaces are also a schema. So you need to relate them. So every device needs an interface. So you establish this relationship. And what's interesting is that you don't see anything about API code. No, you don't see. It's just an YAML file. And every single endpoint will be created. So you do not need to develop an API. So once you import the schema, the API is ready for you to consume data. That establishes a very good practice. And what or how does that change in our lives, right? So let's start with InfraHub Docker. I always recommend that at the beginning of a project, when you are trying to understand the platform, start with Docker. So here you can see that with 3 commands, I was already able to upload just so I told the system to upload the system with the code, and then it was ready for me at port 8000. Very simple. And somebody may ask you, no, but I want to increase availability. So what should I do? So InfraHub also allows you to do that using Kubernetes, for example, if you want to do that. So it's very simple for you to enable that in Docker. Let me see here. If you're interested, you say, oh, William, I don't want to have that in my infrastructure, but I want to learn about that. So there is this sandbox. You can use this QR code available. So you can access the InfraHub that's in the cloud and with many pieces of information so that you can see how that works. This is a screenshot of a front end. It's also important to say that if you pay attention to the side, here right-hand side, or actually on the left-hand side, there are many pieces of information because I imported all standard schemas. What is also nice that you can import only the schemas that are part of your daily operations. So when I started using Netbox, I was part of radio, but I never worked with radio. So I just wondered why I would need that. Now at InfraHub, you can import only what you really need. So for example, you have here optical multiplexer. If you don't use that, you don't need to import that schema. Import only what you need to have on your day-to-day. And that allows you to have a more personalized personalized system because of the InfraHub schema driving. So this is an example of data versioning. In this slide, we have a main branch with my production data. And I wanted another branch that I called Project DF for Brasilia, for example, in which I created a piece of equipment called Edge Router-DF. So as you can see that what I did in this branch is not displayed on the network device. So I can delete it, I can do anything. It won't affect the main branch. So that's the idea underlying branches. So you can play, you can create, delete, that will not have impact on your production. And once we work with Git, for those of you who are developer or who use it, once you want to pick information from a branch and have it on your main branch, you need to send a request. Okay, so I made some changes in this branch and I want to have that on the main branch. So you have a reviewer, it's a person, not the developer, that will actually check to see if everything that was done is right. And then before sending to the production branch, they can say, oh, you forgot to have one IP or the name of the equipment. So that means that you have another trial layer. And besides the reviewer, this person is going to check these pieces of information. Because it's already a bit native, you can also create unit tests to validate everything that you created. So that's very interesting. It's also native. And you can see here the arrow, I indicated the manager as a reviewer because I created the Edge Router DF. And then this other user needs to check if everything was properly done. So at InfraHub, they called it proposed change. And within a proposed change, there is a menu so that you can check, for example, data. So diff means the difference between what's in the main branch and the branch I created. So here you can see on the slide that we see the edge, router, DF, the interface, everything that's different is listed here as a difference. We also have artifacts, just as I mentioned earlier. So there is a template that's already listing all the InfraHub equipment. And this is very simple with the name of equipment and the name of interfaces. But that will depend on what you had in your template and what you have consumed from the API. But before moving to, once again, to the main branch, it has generated artifacts, and that allows us to check if it is as it should be. This is just one example, so a jump on how a Jinja template works. I just mentioned the pipeline and ASD, but here it's called checks. It's a Python script, and it will validate what you have determined in that script and to check if it follows the rules you created. So here I'm validating the name of equipment. So all my equipment here should be called Edge. If it does not have Edge, it's gonna tell you that it's wrong and that you cannot have it on the main branch. Once again, this is a checks in Python. It's not much complex nor that simple. Just an example. And finally, proposed change. As I mentioned earlier, there is a reviewer, and in this screenshot, I try to approve the change I made. But then InfraHub says, no, you cannot do it because you have indicated somebody else for approving the changes.
feita pelo usuário que eu
And
indiquei.
then after that, we have the approval by the reviewer, and then we can then ask for the merge request. So take the data from the branch I created and have that in the production branch. And now you can see that it's available in the main branch. So we have the versioning, and you have the explanation of why I did that. And at the same time, it's nice because you can do the go back and you have everything documented in the platform itself. Now, in order to close, let me talk to you about schemas. So I created a schema talking about TechX. Could be MTP, could be any other model that I wanted to implement in my InfraHub. Yesterday, I was talking to Rodrigo, talking about OPCDN, but with InfraHub, we could then modulate BGP. We could do that one for hot policy, a schema for BGP, and then you can relate that. You can have also BGP communities, so you have all data documented in InfraHub so that you can, for example, release a new traffic, for example. So in a very simple way, you can create the schemas. This is just a sequence of commands in order to import TACAX commands. So using the interfaces, so it's InfraHub CTL. So I indicate the file, then it will import that file. And if there is no error, because it will pre-validate it, TACAX will be available at the front end and also available to generate automations. So here I have already created the schema. I create one TechX for Fortaleza as an example. I added the device edge router for Fortaleza. And now you can see that there is a TechX related. So that allows me to automate it. And here the GraphQL working. And as you saw, we did not have to develop API. It was very simple. I just imported the API is already available. I can already consume data, both of the equipment and TACAX. Conclusions, InfraHub is guided by the following pillars: Git native, flexible schemas, GraphQL, and automation with GitOps. But it's also very important to talk about some details. So this was developed in 2023, so only 3 years. If you compare to NetBox that was developed in 2016, we know that the latter is much more popular. But I like to say that InfraHub is a tool that is being adopted in the US and in Europe, and it's a very promising tool for our near future. Thank you very much, and now I'm available to answer your questions. Well, there are 3 questions coming from YouTube, from Leonardo Almeida. What about the licensing of InfraHub? What is the level of the manufacturer? Also, Leonardo asked, so InfraHub, does it have modules to access also network modules so that you can have a load of data, or do I need to update the database from time to time? And a question from Henry Godoy. Does it support GNME for automation and telemetry? First question about company that develops it. I'm going to talk about InfraHub, but the same applies to NetBox and Nodobot. So we have the enterprise version in which you have a support closer to the developer, and you have the community, the free of charge version. So if you want to ask anything for them, you need to open an issue and then you wait. So it's the same situation. So you have the paid version and you have the free version. And the same applies for the NetBox, Nodebox. Of course, they want you to buy the enterprise version, but it's the same idea. Second question. It's about integration and the load, right? So InfraHub Same thing for Netbox and Otherbox. In order to access the equipment, the tools have everything for you to develop a script in Python to access them, get the data, and then have automated import. But that's not native. You need to be knowledgeable in order to develop that. And in answering Henry's question, not native, but you can use it with Python. You can import the protocol and use it. And that is applicable to the three tools available. Thank you very much, Will. So this is your token.
Dando continuidade à nossa
Now let's
programação,
continue with our program, our
queria
agenda.
convidar o Luiz Eduardo
I'd like to
Paz
invite
Salomão,
Luis
da
Eduardo
Polícia
Salomão
Civil
from
do
the
Distrito
Civil
Federal.
Police of the Federal
Ele vai falar,
District,
precisamos falar
and he will
sobre
talk to
infostealers.
us about, we need to talk about infostealers.
Beleza, pessoal? Boa tarde. Vamos dar
Good
continuidade ao
afternoon,
evento.
everyone.
Aqui
So
trazendo uma
let's
outra
continue.
pegada, apesar de ser
But let's
infraestrutura,
switch gears.
vamos falar um
Although
pouquinho
this is
também
an
de segurança
infrastructure
cibernética,
event,
né?
let's talk about
Ah,
cybersecurity.
Então, o tema da apresentação é InfoStealer. Para quem não
So
conhece o assunto,
I'm
eu
going to
vou
talk
trazer uma
about
introdução, a gente vai avançar um pouquinho
infostealers.
para a
So
prática
if you're
também,
not aware of what
mas
that
já
is,
adianto, vamos focar
I'm
um
gonna
pouquinho na
give you
situação de
that
abuso de
definition.
redes,
So let's
né,
talk
questão de
about the
bloqueio de
abuse
IPs também,
taking
só que do
place
ponto
and
de vista de
also
SOC,
blocking
uma
IPs,
atuação
but
de
from the
resposta a incidentes
standpoint
cibernéticos, tá?
of a
Então, eu sou Luiz
response
Eduardo Paz
to
Salomão, tá? Eu sou
cyber
agente de polícia
attacks.
na Polícia Civil
So
do Distrito
I'm
Federal.
a police
Faço parte da
agent at
equipe de
the civil
resposta a
police. I'm
incidentes
part
cibernéticos da
of the
PCDF,
team that
tá?
responds to incidents.
Graças a Deus, dentro da PCDF, nós temos uma
And
equipe
thank
de
God, at
agentes de
our
polícia
department, we do
dedicada
have
a
police
responder incidentes
officers
cibernéticos.
that are dedicated
A
to
atuação nossa
responding to
rotineira
cyber
é
attacks, cybercrime.
resposta contra ameaças que estão visando a
And
Polícia Civil
we
do DF,
respond
tá?
to
Tem
threats
algumas
to the
certificações na
civil
área, mas a
police
gente
of the
vamos direto ao
federal
próximo.
district.
Uma observação aqui é que essa apresentação ela é totalmente livre, inclusive para quem está
This
de casa, provavelmente já está
presentation
disponível no
can be
site.
shared. I
Então,
believe
enquanto
it's
os colegas
already
vão
available
validar
on
as
the
imagens,
website,
os
so it's
prints
much
ficados
easier
pelo
if you
PDF está
can
disponibilizado
download
no
the
site do
PDF
fórum,
made
tá?
available at this forum's
Beleza, outro
website.
ponto é que os
Okay,
prints, tudo que for apresentado aqui,
and
não tem
everything
nenhuma
that I'm
relação com
sharing
investigações
here
ativas
has
da Polícia
no
Civil do Distrito Federal,
relationship to
sendo
any
trabalho
active
totalmente
investigation
de
being
inteligência de
conducted by
ameaças
the federal
cibernéticas no
police.
intuito de
It's just
defesa
an
institucional, tá?
intelligence service.
Beleza. Então, uma introdução aqui. O que
Okay,
são infostealers?
so
Tá?
what are
Basicamente, são ataques
infostealers?
maliciosos, ou seja,
It's
são malwares,
malwares
que foram desenvolvidos com o intuito
that were
específico de
developed
roubar
targeting
informações de
stealing
dispositivos.
information
Basicamente,
from
informações que
devices.
são capturadas são
Basically,
credenciais corporativas, na grande maioria das
corporate
vezes, tá?
information
Os
most of
infostealers,
the
eles são
time.
considerados uma evolução natural do spyware,
They are
né? Dos
considered to
famosos
be a
espiões aí,
natural evolution
malwares
of
incríveis.
spyware.
Uma métrica aqui, uma informação bem importante,
Just
já
a
relevante em
very
relação aos
important
infostealers,
piece of
é que
information is
70%
that
dos dispositivos
70%
infectados, eles são
of
pessoais,
devices that
são
have been
corporativos,
infected, they
e a
are
relevância
personal
desse dado,
devices. And the relevance of this piece of information will be discussed later on so that you understand
para entender sobre infostealers,
its importance.
termo que eu já quero introduzir aqui para
I'd like
vocês
to
é sobre
also
cybercrime as a
introduce
crime cibernético como
another
serviço.
terminology
Basicamente,
here,
em que o
cybercrime
hacker,
as
então o
service.
hacker no termo
So it's been a
técnico,
long
né?
time that a
Ele era um
hacker or
indivíduo, uma
cracker
pessoa que
was
atuava
an
de forma
individual
autónoma, então em
that
pequenos
worked
grupos,
alone
com
or
com
in
o
small
intuito ali,
groups
na realidade, com alta
with
expertise
the
em todas
goal.
as
Well, they
etapas do
had a high
ataque, tá?
expertise
E
related to the
generalista,
cyber
ele podia
attack and they were
escalar o crime
generalists.
cibernético.
It was a low-scale
Passou-se
attack.
por uma etapa de industrialização, onde
As if it
o
were an
criminoso percebeu que seria
industrialization
muito mais
step where
fácil
criminals realize
separar
it's
as
a lot
etapas do
easier
ataque
to
cibernético
separate the
em
different steps
subetapas,
of a
e essas
cyber
subetapas
attack into
poderiam ser
sub-steps.
comercializadas
with that, we could commercialize so that other people could use them as a classic model for signature and what we know as software as a service.
Beleza. Então, dentro do crime, do cybercrime as a service, existe
So within
malware as a service. Então,
cybercrime as a service, we have malware as a service. So for any service, and this is basically it, any service could be commercialized from the point of view of the criminal. And malware is included in here. And in this malware commercialization, we have InfoShiller, and that is why they can also be called InfoShiller as a service. I will quickly talk about a theory of content. What is the InfoShiller ecosystem, and why is the malware so popular today? It starts with the development of a malware and the development of a panel where other criminals can purchase. So the first thing is try to go after the panel where you will have access and will put everything together. And this happens within dark web fora and the underground materials is also available. Okay, so in there, you have advertisers who are well known and they are considered as the official advertisers, but new ones come up as the one you can see in 2025. The Santa Stiller, in the beginning, it sounded like a joke, but today they have contaminated many devices. Just for you to have an idea, this is the first step, and in a monthly signature of $200, $300, or even lasting ones. This has to do with client service, client support, and this is only one example. It's been translated, but it is an example of Linktree for the support of a fraudster called Vida. And as you can see, it's not a dark web domain. And then after the acquisition, somebody develops the malware, makes it available for signature, and then another criminal comes in and signs it. And then we need the distribution of malware. And now we have a terminology which is called spray and pray. Attackers must infect as many devices as possible. So their interest is for the computers to have malware included, because the more prevention they can capture, the higher the chance of having something more valuable for them. There's something that has always been valuable but has increased a lot. I will say it informally. The massive presence of activators and cracks, as well as racks or sheets for games. Okay? And in this regard, since 2021, 2020, we already had reports of threats with posts related to cracks, as I mentioned, sheets. But more recently, criminals have also realized that this was fertile grounds because of posts like this. So this is the best way to infect as many devices as possible. And this is the example of another forum, another dark web forum, where criminals ask one another what the best way would be to distribute malware, and then somebody goes in there and they say, okay, do this, or create a YouTube channel, include tutorials about program cracks, game sheets. So this is a recent post. There are examples of videos that are very common in YouTube, and you can investigate anything related to crack or applications such as Adobe, which is
qualquer
expensive,
suite, qualquer
or
programa
any
da Adobe,
suite or
então
program of the
Valorant,
Adobe
Roblox,
suite,
jogos desse
or
tipo estão
Blots,
muito em alta.
games
Se
like
vocês
that
entrarem no YouTube e fizerem uma
are
pesquisa de termos relacionados, vocês vão ver que está
very
infestado de conteúdo desse tipo, e dia após dia são
valuable,
publicados
and you will
novos
see that
conteúdos, tá?
they are infested all over and they have new
Feita a
content
distribuição
on
ali,
a constant
passa para a etapa
basis.
de
So once you
captura.
have the
Não vou entrar
distribution,
aqui, não
you
temos tempo de
go to
desenvolver
the
como é que
capture
funciona a captura
phase.
da credencial, mas é importante que vocês
The
saibam que
most
normalmente
important
se
thing
apresenta
is
um
that
mecanismo do Windows,
they use a Windows
basicamente a
mechanism
maioria dos infostiles eles são
where,
direcionados para
where
infecção
in most
do
of the
Windows, tá?
cases they
Mas
are
o
related
melhor
to
método,
Windows
o melhor
infection,
método de
but
se
the
capturar a
best
credencial
method
é a partir de
to
uma API
capture these
chamada
credentials are
Data
based on
Protection
an
API, tá?
API called Data Protection
Quando
API.
programa do Windows
And then when we
habilita
have
a
a
possibilidade de
program,
armazenamento de
it
senha e tal
enables the
sobre todos os
possibility
navegadores,
of
eles fazem uma chamada para essa API que criptografa a informação
users,
e
they
armazena no banco
cryptograph
de dados local.
information and
No
store
caso da
it in their
imagem
local database. And in
à
the case
direita,
of the
ela é um
image
exemplo
on the
Chrome,
right
tá? O Chrome
side,
armazena essa
this
credencial
is an
dentro de uma
example of
pasta
Chrome where
um
this
arquivo
is
chamado
stored
login
in
data.
a folder called
E lá dentro,
login
obviamente,
data.
em tese
And then,
criptografado,
of
os
course,
próprios programas precisam ter acesso à
the programs
credencial, então
themselves
eles
need to
pedem essa
have
criptografia
access.
e essa reversão é feita
We
também por
must
intermédio do DPAP.
cryptograph, and this is done by
E aí
means of
que entra
DPAP.
na captura
And
uma
that's
outra forma de
when
abuso,
another
né,
form
que
of
é
abuse
chamada de
comes in. It
Dead
is
Drop
called
Resolver.
dead drop
O atacante,
resolver.
beleza, ele foi lá, já seguiu todo esse fluxo, conseguiu infectar
Go through the whole
dispositivos, tá?
flow,
E
they
quando é feita essa
infect
infecção,
devices, and when
ele
this
precisa
happens,
pegar a
they
credencial, tá?
need to get
Essa
the
forma de
credentials.
comunicação do dispositivo
And
infectado por
this
local que
communication of the infected device,
vai ser armazenada essa credencial, esse local
where this
normalmente é um
credential
servidor
would be
chamado
stored, and
servidor de
it's
C2
usually a
comando e
server
controle,
called
que em
C2
tese não é
service,
para ser
command
enviada
and
pelo
control.
malware com o servidor de destino, senão
It's
vai
not
gerar
directly
alertas se o
between the
servidor dele cair
malware and the
no
destination
futuro for
service. And
flagrado
if
como
in the
malicioso,
future
então passar
it
por um
is
takedown,
considered a
ele
malware or
perde a
goes through a
comunicação
takedown, it
com o
loses
dispositivo infectado ou com
communication
outros
with the
que serão
infected
infectados. Então, o
device.
que o pessoal tem feito
And
ultimamente?
so what
Em
have
vez de
people
apontar diretamente
done
para um
more
servidor
recently?
malicioso
Instead
chamado
of
controle,
using
eu
a
aponto para um
command and
serviço
control
legítimo e dentro desse
service,
serviço
it
legítimo
uses a
eu faço um
legitimate
comentário que
one
aponta para o
where
meu
they make
C2. Então,
comments
basicamente,
pointing
quando
to
o infector, que nesse
the
caso foi
provider. And
infectado,
when InfoShealer, in this
a primeira
case,
URL que
was
vocês estão
done on
vendo
the top, the
é um link
first
para o
URL
Telegram.
that you can
E
see
dentro do Telegram
is
há
for
uma descrição do
Telegram.
grupo do Telegram
In
com
there,
o
you have a
C2, que é
description
o
for
link embaixo,
C2
hungrypixel.com.
with
E por que que
hungrypixel.com.
como eu falei, por que que isso é
So,
feito?
as I
Pela
mentioned, why is
facilidade do
this done?
atacante poder
Because
modificar o
it's
C2 dele
easier
toda
for the
vez que for
attacker
pegado
to
como malicioso.
identify it
Então,
every
aquele
time it
link
is
desse
considered
mesmo
as
Telegram,
malware.
no
So,
intervalo de
the
mês, ele
same
muda,
Telegram
né?
within a month
Primeiro,
period changing
hungrypixel.com,
from
depois vocês podem ver que
one
ele
to the
virou
other,
hungrytoast
and
e
you will
agora
see that
recentemente ganhou
it's
esse outro nome aqui,
become Angry Talk
então
Show,
é isso
and
que
then now
acontece,
this
né?
other
É
funny
feita uma
name. So
requisição
this is
para o
what
Telegram,
happens.
para Steam ou
They
qualquer
go into
outro
Telegram, Pulsing, or
serviço
any
legítimo
other
e depois
legitimate service,
o
and
malware
then
resolve para o
afterwards the
destino a partir disso,
malware
sei lá, às vezes está nesse aqui que é um
changes the
comentário
destination
na
like a
descrição do grupo do
comment or
Telegram,
a
tá?
description in Telegram
E a
group.
etapa final, vocês viram, né, que tem uma assinatura
And then the
para o
final
atacante
step, you
participar
can
dessas
see a
cadeias, né,
signature
de
for
comprometimentos,
participants,
e ele precisa de dinheiro
and
também, né?
they
Não é
need
só
to make
gastar
money
$300
as
por
well.
mês.
It's not
Aí então
just
entra na etapa
about
de
spending
monetização, que é
$300
quem
per
fez
month.
as
And then they
infecções
move
de
on to the
dispositivo, tá?
monetization of those who
Normalmente,
infected the
a gente
devices.
percebe muito
Usually
em
we
fóruns
can
underground
clearly see underground
são
fora
focos diferentes, eu não pude trazer,
that
não
these
consegui
are
trazer todos aqui agora por conta do tempo, mas
these are
nome que
different
fica bem
things.
explícito na cabeça de
I cannot
vocês
share everything with you because
URL, URL Login
we don't
Pass,
have that
essa é
much
uma forma de
time. But
divulgação dos logs
what
de
you can see
infostiles, tá?
here is a way to
Normalmente esses logs eles são
disseminate
vendidos
these.
por
Usually
dispositivo
these logs
infectado.
are
Cada
sold
dispositivo infectado
according to
vale
the
mais ou
number of
menos
devices
$5,
infected, that they are worth
$10.
more or
Então
less
é mais
$5 or
leve de
$10.
falar
Can
a
you imagine
infecção,
it? So
tá?
they have to
Mas a
escalate
melhor
the
forma de
infection.
ganhar dinheiro
But
em
the best
cima
way to
desses
make
comprometimentos
money based
credenciais é a
on
partir de
these
uma figura chamada
credentials
Initial Access Broker,
involvement
que são os
is
famosos
what we call
geradores. O
initial
que acontece? Esses
brokers,
são
the famous
traduzindo, são
these,
corretores,
and
são
these are
um grupo
brokers.
criminoso
Another group of criminals. They purchase the infrastructure loggers, they curate them and identify valid credentials that are worth a lot of money. And then They use much higher prices. As I told you, perhaps it's difficult for you to tell here, but here you can see it announced for $1,000. I just mentioned that an InfoSchiller logger is worth 5 and the difference is significant. Another example of advertisement, this is recent. I will fast forward though because of for the sake of time. Anyway, usually the link will be seen directly. This is what we call a direct link for download. So this is a link for a post inside YouTube. It's as if it were a blog. This is called social gate in the reports. Another way would be to send it directly to a blog. They call it landing page. This is a common name. We have a link in a YouTube post. It is sent to another blog and then to the final link, and it will be a link that we're all used to.
Não trouxe aqui dados sobre isso, mas já vou adiantando para vocês que grande maioria de downloads de InfoSchiller hoje em dia
most of these downloads these days have been directed to MediaFinder. Sometimes they're seen in OneDrive, but most of the times that's where they are at.
Beleza, feito o download, né? Não pude trazer a etapa completa.
I was not able to share the complete analysis, but I wanted to provoke you a little bit. I don't mean that Microsoft IPs cannot be used on the day-to-day, but if I have topics that go through communication once the malware is executed and these IPs are from Microsoft or Google, then I start analyzing according to the other one. But in this case, it was easy. The only different IP we had, and I checked it, it belonged to a VPS from Finland. But the point is, this is a website. Many of you mentioned it yesterday, IP info. In terms of security, we use a lot Abuse PDB. It uses IP info information and opens a possibility for the community to ask questions about that IP, whether it's seen in different sites or not. So if I see it in Abuse PDB and I see that there is a relationship with InfoSchiller, sometimes InfoSocs of large companies will block that IP. I don't know whether you check it like that, but this is a very active communication. And okay, so the IP is the only different one. It goes through analysis of communication, and what we can see is that after this, we open an ATLS and you see hello client. So there is a TLS connection. But in this case, without the SNI on purpose, the criminals know that SNI comes in clear text. So other people can identify what the destination domain is. But as they remove the destination domain and only use IP, this is a little bit more difficult since I have to provide better information to understand what IP we're actually talking about. So, expanding our communications a little bit more, we have repeated communications involving that IP. I downloaded the file from YouTube, and it was only executed as an Adobe activator. And you can see that you have a client hello and then application data. You open the connection, and then you have the TLS, data transfer.
repetitiva ali, e isso
There
é
is
uma
repetitive
característica de
cadence, and
comunicações que a gente
this
optou
is
fazer
a
para vocês,
characteristics
chamado de
of
servidor de comando e controle, tá?
communications. They're
Basicamente,
called
para
command
ficar
and
com esse negócio,
control, and
ele está
basically in
filtrando as
practice,
credenciais do computador
this
e
is what
mandando
we
para o servidor
see.
lá.
They send it to the server.
Beleza? Só para deixar mais claro que nesse caso
To make it
se tratava
clearer,
de infochiller mesmo,
to make sure that this was
arquivo
indeed an
que não foi
infochiller.
executado era
The file which was not executed was a tap.xp. It opened a process, and they are related to Chrome. They're looking for information stored in the navigator. There is one file which does not have anything to do with the file, and we have two, and it's going after DPAP, one of the main capture mechanisms stored in the device. Initially, if I looked for the file that was downloaded or other introductory information of static analysis about the file and virus totem or any other safety consultation systems, I would not have a return indicating that it's malware. But as I execute it, analyze the IP, which would have a relationship with a malware, and I start consulting it according to the IP, I can see that it had to do with command and control related to VDAR.
Beleza. Durante incidentes relacionado ao a
And then,
infochillers, como eu falei para vocês,
regarding
normalmente não
infochillers,
tem
as I
ação
told you,
dos IABs, os initial access
usually
brokers, né?
the initial access brokers come into action. Once they get the credentials, they must make sure it is valid. And this is seen like that in the log, the same IP, the same origin, testing access in different accounts. So this is an actual case here. We even have accounts that were not active, and in this case, once again, many people and even large companies look at this and they decide to declare or announce an incident. But it is important to understand that this is not how it works, and that it's not to block an infochiller or an initial access broker. It's important to understand, to track the origin of the malware, to understand what pathway the criminal used. And this will be seen in other moments, and we'll be able to identify whatever happened. I'm not sharing the step by step, but for you to have an idea of what happened. After having investigated and tried to locate the log article of folder that was being disseminated in underground fora. In the InfoShila logs, there's a file that deals with system information. Not only will it bring credentials, but apps that were installed, and even information on the operational conditions. So this is a file of system information, and it has an IP on the top, and also the name of the computer. So, in addition to being important, tracking it to understand what is happening and prevent this from happening, it's important to keep in mind 70% of the infected devices are personal, however, 30% are corporate. And so I will block IP, reset user passwords. But the IP that we can see in the log on the top starts like this. In the logs, and I can see access to the system, and it was clear that it had to do with a legitimate IP. It is an IP used for system authentication by the person who was accessing it, which means that the log indicated the device that had been infected.
Não, eu não trouxe aqui o outro print, mas tem um outro print sobre essa
I don't have
análise
another
que mostra
screenshot,
os
but
aplicativos
we
instalados,
examined
os
that and we
aplicativos
saw
instalados de
the
Roblox, Valorant,
devices, and we have
internet,
Valorant and
jogos
many
que
other
atraem a presença de malware
games that
dentro
actually
de
attract
chips, como eu falei para
malware
vocês,
inside the
que a
chip.
gente chegou na conclusão de que
So
basicamente
we
essa
came to the
foi
conclusion that
esse foi o paciente zero de todo o
this
incidente que
was the
acontecido aí
zero
no
patient
nosso
of the
caso, tá?
entire
E
incident
ele
that
de
had
fora
happened.
do dispositivo corporativo, o
And it
dispositivo
was
pessoal da pessoa,
outside the corporate
do
device. So it
servidor, no caso,
started with the
que
personal
compartilhava acesso
device.
com o filho dele, tá
And
bom?
this person
E
shared
aí a
access with
pergunta,
his
se a maior
son.
parte
So
das
the
infecções
question is,
ocorrem no
if
dispositivo
most of
pessoal,
infections take
por
place
que
in
que as
personal
empresas são tão
devices,
afetadas? E aí
why are
a resposta está
companies
justamente
so
nisso aí,
affected?
tá?
The answer lies
Muitas
here.
pessoas
Many
utilizam
people
o navegador
use
com a conta sincronizada. E
a
esse, como eu
synchronized
falei, é o principal motivo dos
web
infostíveis. O camarada tá
search
lá no computador
engine,
da
the same
empresa
engine.
acreditando
So
que está
the
super
individual
seguro,
is
faz
using the
acesso na conta
corporate
pessoal dele
laptop,
no
so they
navegador, naquele
access
computador,
them
habilita a opção
his
de
personal
sincronização.
account,
Quando
then
acessa o computador em
they
casa com
make
a
a
mesma
sync. So
conta,
once
o
they
computador de
access the
casa baixa
laptop at
todas as
home,
senhas para lá e
they will
criptografam com
then,
o
that
DPAP.
laptop will
Daí o
download
infostealer
all
instala o
passwords, and then the
procedimento
info
inverso para pegar as
stealer
senhas
will
e
then
desfiltrar, como eu acabei
get
de mostrar para
and
vocês.
then obtain the
Conclusões, para
information. So
encerrar,
if you
né,
use the
não deu
same
para aprofundar
browser,
muito agora por conta do
I
tempo,
was not able to
mas os
go in
infostealers,
depth
por uma vez,
because of
vocês
time, but
frequentemente
modern
burlam
info
soluções de segurança,
stealers,
tá?
they
Mesmo que tenha, né, a maioria das
really
pessoas
are
aqui deve ter,
able to
se tiver
go
o Windows
around the
em casa, vai ter o Microsoft Defender, que é de
security
graça,
measures. So you will
Defender
have the
mais burlado, mais
defender that
bypassado
is
por
not
infostealers, tá?
really, does not stop
Então,
criminals.
burlam soluções anti-malware e dispositivos
So
pessoais.
most of
Mas
malware
a
affects
exfiltração
personal
de dados que eu
devices,
mostrei para
but
vocês
just as
gera
I
padrões de
showed
rede
you,
que são
that will then
identificados, como, por exemplo,
generate some
conexões
standards that
TLS
can
para
be
IPs
identified.
sem
For example,
SNI, ou então
TLS
domínios
connections
em
for
próprios
IPs
jogos, que foi
without
como eu mostrei para vocês,
SNI,
o
or that
apontamento
drop
para um servidor e
resolvers
depois
domains. So
resolvendo
it
o
starts with a
verdadeiro
legit
domínio
platform, and then
do
you
servidor de
can
comando e
see
controle.
that
Obviamente, assim como
actual
na maioria da
domain.
parte dos crimes hoje
And
em dia,
just as
plataformas
most
legítimas
crimes
são
today,
frequentemente
legit
abusadas para fins
platforms are
ilícitos, né? E
usually
uma rede infestada
abused
de
for
dispositivos
illicit
infectados por
ends,
infostealers
and there is a
vai acabar em
network
blacklist do
infested
provider. Isso é fato.
of
Em
devices with
ambientes
info
ODA e
stealers
NAT,
that
o
will end up
comportamento
in
malicioso de
global
um dispositivo
blacklists.
infectado
And
pode
in
comprometer a
CGNet,
reputação de centenas
the
de usuários e
malware
levar ao
behavior of a
bloqueio de
single
acesso de
device
todos
infected
que
can affect the
compartilham aquele
reputation
IP.
of hundreds of users that use the
É
same
isso, pessoal.
public
Muito
IP.
obrigado.
That's it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Temos perguntas para o Luiz Eduardo?
Are there questions for Luis Eduardo?
Opa, boa tarde, Luiz
Good
Eduardo.
afternoon.
Bom-vindo aí à SP Fox. Parabéns aí pela palestra.
Congratulations for your
Uma coisa que
talk.
tem que se preocupar bastante.
This is something that
Eu tenho curiosidade,
really is of our concern.
dentre essas pesquisas
But considering
né, que vocês têm
your
feito,
studies and
vocês
everything you have
notaram
been
também
doing,
algum uso
have you noticed the
do
use
artifício, por exemplo, utilizando o DNS,
of
DNS da
having
Cloudflare, por exemplo, um
using
registro
DNS from
TXT também para
Cloudflare,
integrar
also
esse tipo de coisa, ou foi só em
TXT
cima de Telegram
registry,
ou
or was it
Cloudflare, cara.
just on top of
Cloudflare, né?
A
Telegram?
maior parte da humanidade vai para
Cloudflare.
Cloudflare.
Most of them go
Telegram é uma
actually to
coisa que aparece, mas
Cloudflare.
normalmente
This is what we
são
see,
atacantes específicos,
and we see
famílias
some
específicas de infostealer que utilizam
specific
essa
groups of
técnica,
info
normalmente via
stealers
alguma
that
outra aí que agora eu não me
use
lembro,
this
mas a grande
technique.
maioria vai para o
So
lado da
most
Cloudflare.
of them, they
Eles têm
will go
API, então
towards
fácil de
Cloudflare.
adotar
Yes,
o
because they
Com
have the
certeza, Cloudflare.
Obrigado.
IP.
Valeu.
Okay, thank you.
Tem alguma pergunta remota? Não. Então,
Do we have any
muito
questions
obrigado.
over the internet? No? Okay, so thank you so much for your presentation.
Bom, vamos para a última apresentação aqui
Okay,
do
so
nosso
let's
programa.
now start the last presentation of the day. I'd like to invite Maria de Souza from Lumina Consultoria e Capacitação. Her talk is The End of Net Neutrality via AI is the Fortaleza IXP ready for the legal shock? Oh, I'm scared already. Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Well, the idea was really to scare all of you. We want you to be concerned, and that would also help us to have attendees here. It's hard to be the last speaker, especially being a holiday here in the city of Fortaleza. But before I start my presentation, I'd like to start by expressing my special thanks to Moreiras for accepting this painful issue. I'd like to thank Julio and all organizers. So those involved in management, production, because this was certainly a wonderful event. Because I know that you don't know me, and I think that being humble is a good thing, right? So rather than start with my presentation, I'd like to start by introducing myself, but in a different way. I know that lawyers, they enjoy introducing themselves in a certain way, but I'm a lawyer and I work with technology for 20 years. I'm wearing high heels, but this is just to look better. But I'm always wearing tennis shoes, discussing the issues with my clients, and also in discussing what we do regarding regulation of emerging technologies. Yesterday, Tiago mentioned something I really enjoyed. He talked about dialogue. He talked about dialoguing with the market, the academia, users, and also the regulatory agents. But that should not demonize the companies. And I am a lawyer. My master's degree in fundamentals of law, but my DNA, I don't know, was not infected by Article 37, but rather by Article 170, which is the one that protects economic activity. Because if we did not have companies, if we did not have entrepreneurs ready to lie their assets at risk, would not be here, because the state would not be able to handle everything. So I hold a master's degree in public law, social evolution. I'm also an advisory board member to some companies working with emerging technologies. And my work and my focus is to build this frontier between infrastructure and technology. I am a professor in MBA and LLM at UERJ, and also at Estácio University. For 12 years, I was the director of digital inclusion in Rio de Janeiro, working with different courts.
A palavra agora me fugiu, mas pelo processo eletrônico,
I drew a blank, but it was for electronic access. Because of that, I was awarded twice, and more recently, I was part of a team and represented the court the Federal Network of Cybernetic Incident Management. But as I mentioned, my DNA led me the decision to leave that. So what I want is to transform whatever is technical into strategical guideline, also legal security, institutional resilience, and to concretely contribute for digital sovereignty. In order to avoid a very boring presentation by a lawyer, and I knew that you were going to address that. Brazil is so large. There are so many different realities. I was born in the state of Pernambuco, so I feel at home here. And I don't feel like that in some other parts of Brazil. I'm not going to name them anyway, but I read this quote on Forbes, and I thought that it really fits that. Best answers emerge when we create space so that people can present their different perspectives.
Then this is what we see here. This is very serious work done by Anatel, academic work by the civil police. And we also saw the presentation by the chief of police. I heard of things that I had never heard of. And all of us can be affected by such facts. I have an opinion that the laws that deal with technology as opposed to other laws cannot be very close, the strict laws with a very defined scope. And why? Law very hardly anticipates. It comes to solve installed problems. In technology, if I take this, I end up preventing the economic development or preventing a greater or a better use of technology, actually. And that's why I brought it here. This is a provocation. These are tiny little seeds. I do not intend to leave it here with a badge saying that I discovered something new or rocket science, but this is something for us to consider. And then everywhere I go, artificial intelligence is present today. I was the Amazon from the apocalypse to bring in this topic. It's been a pleasure to spend a couple of days listening about technical facts and not just AI, as people want us to believe in. So this is why I wanted to provoke you, the end of neutrality and the strengths. This is a much greater provocation which encompasses all of Brazil regarding the policies determined by the Ministry of Education. If you think of a TikTok's data center, and if we think of geography and the curvature of Earth, it would be a lot closer than if this data center had been built in the state of Acre, in the very north of Brazil. We would have to cross the Andes, but in terms of distance, it would make a lot more sense there. In Fortaleza,
para
it is
receber. Ela
prepared
tem
to
tudo
receive.
aquilo
It
que
has
uma grande
everything
empresa que
that a
precisa
large
instalar
company which
um
needs
data center,
to
que
install a
precisa
data
ter
center
essa
and that
troca dos
needs to
PTTs,
have
tem
this
a ter,
exchange
inclusive em se
in
tratando
PTTs,
de matriz energética,
especially
não é?
when we're
Porque nós
dealing with
temos
energy
vento,
matrices,
nós
because
temos
we have
água,
wind, we
nós
have
temos
water,
como manter essa
we
operação
can
funcionando
maintain
com
this
o mínimo
operation
de
working
interrupções possível.
with the least
Então,
interruptions
enquanto a gente não tinha
possible.
a IA também
And when
trazida para dentro, né,
AI
da
was
melhoria,
not
do
part of the
aprimoramento
improvements
dos, dos data centers, dos
of the data
PTTs, nós
centers and the
trabalhávamos ali a partir de
PPTs,
uma perspectiva do melhor esforço.
we
O
worked
Brasil,
based
com o
on a
marco-civil da
perspective of the least
internet,
effort.
ele foi, sem dúvida
Brazil,
nenhuma,
within
país que chamou a
the
atenção do mundo
internet framework,
para a
called
regulação
the
da
attention of
internet.
the world
Eu,
to
com
the
muita
regulation of
humildade,
the
ouso
internet.
discordar da
I
doutora
humbly disagree
Flávia, quando ela diz
from
que
Flavia when she says
o
that
reconhecimento parcial do artigo
partial
19
acknowledgement
do
of
Marco Civil da
Article
Internet
19 of the Internet
não
Civil
é ganho.
Framework is
Eu, como
not
uma
a
advogada que
gain.
atua com
I, as a
tecnologia, que
lawyer who
preciso
works with
lidar com
technology,
big
and
techs,
I
com empresas
need
de
to deal with big
tecnologia,
techs
se a
and
gente não vai
technology
com uma ordem
companies, if we
judicial,
do not
isso é
include a
papel
judicial
de
order,
mão, isso é
this is
jogado lá em qualquer canto,
thrown away,
independente do dano que isso
regardless
esteja
of
causando
the
a uma criança, a uma
damage
pessoa física,
this
a
is
uma
causing to a
empresa.
child, to a physical
Então,
person, to a
quando
company.
a
And
gente
so
vem com o
when
Marco Civil
we
e o
come
artigo
with
19 estabelece,
the law where
que as
Article
empresas só
19
são obrigadas
establishes
a
that these
suprimir o
companies
conteúdo,
only
elas
have to
passam a
provide
ter um outro
content,
medo. Que
they
medo
fear
é
something
esse? É
else.
o medo de
And
ser
what is
acusado
it?
de
What is this
censura.
fear? The
E a
fear of being
censura
accused
é
of
algo
censorship.
muito ruim
And
para todos os
censorship
países,
is very
e não
poor
só para o
for every
Brasil. Então, o
country
que
and
que
not
eles
only for
fazem?
Brazil
Eles
alone.
respondem
So what do
sem
they
uma
do? They
determinação
say
judicial,
yes,
eles não
and
vão
that
suprimir o
without
conteúdo. Ao longo do
any
tempo, questões
judicial suit,
relacionadas
they
à
will not remove
pedofilia,
content.
a
And then
revenge
there are
porn,
some contents
acabaram
related to
até
pedophilia
sendo um pouco
and
mais
child
flexíveis,
abuse.
mas
They
outras
became more
envolvendo
flexible, but
empresas,
there are
envolvendo
others involving
denúncias,
companies,
envolvendo agora até fake
involving
news,
even
sem
fake news,
determinação judicial,
without
nós,
any
advogados, meros
legal
mortais, não
determinations. We, as
conseguíamos a
lawyers,
supressão
have not been
desse
able
conteúdo.
to
Então, agora,
eliminate
a gente
this
sai de
content.
uma
So
lógica de
now
uma
we
entrega
go from a
daquilo que é
logic of
possível, de
the
uma
delivery of something
neutralidade
which is
que
possible,
realmente
of a
coloca todos
neutrality
aqueles que
which really
precisam
places
do
all
uso
of those
da
who need
internet, né,
to
em
use
pé
the
de
internet
igualdade, e a gente
on equal
passa a
basis,
ter
and
também
we start
ativo que as
having
empresas vão
an asset
cobrar
that the
de
companies will
concorrência de
demand
serviço,
from
né?
those who
A gente
provide
passa
services,
a
who
ter
provide these
também
services,
uma
and then
performance
we have
garantida. E
a
garantida
guaranteed
pelo quê?
performance.
Por uma
And what
infraestrutura
guarantees it?
programável e
A
inteligente.
programmable,
Decisões que
intelligent
vão passar a
infrastructure
ser
with decisions that will
multissetoriais,
become
reguladas por
multi-sectorial and
milissegundos. E a
regulated
gente
by
não vai ter
milliseconds.
mais
We
um
will no
Marco Civil
longer
falando em
have
neutralidade. A
civil
gente
framework
vai
talking
ter
about
aqui
neutrality.
o quê?
What
A
we will
gente vai ter
have
um network
is
slicing.
a
A gente
network
tem o motor
slicing.
do 5G,
We
que no
have the
Brasil
5G
ainda não
engines, which in
emplacou,
Brazil
porque a gente
hasn't
ainda
been
tem,
used
né?
yet
O
because
Brasil é um
Brazil
país de muitas,
is a
é um país
country,
continental.
is a
A gente falou aqui
continental
ainda há
sized
pouco
country,
do que
and we
pode
talked
acontecer com
about
a Oi,
what
que
could
a Oi vem
happen
aí
with Oi, and
sobrou,
Oi
né, do
comes
sistema
from what is
Telebrás em
left
muitas
from the
áreas,
Telebras
muitos
system
interiores
in
do
many
Brasil
different
só
areas of
tem
Brazil.
acesso
We
a
only have
comunicações
access to
graças
telecommunications
a esse
thanks
mobilizado
to
expandido da Oi
this
e que
mobilized asset from Oi. Nobody wants it because it's expensive to maintain. It's not easy to carry out the maintenance, and oftentimes communication fails. So we have an asset that comes from the Telebras system and the Oi system, and the main players don't want it from smaller ISPs. It is not feasible to maintain them operating. And so we have the idea that AI, when controlling this game with the PTTs and the exchanges, it measures the quality of delivery better, the milliseconds, and it can divide it so that we can work based on priorities. And when we talk about these priorities and when we talk about network priority, this sounds very beautiful. But when we think about how time is worth, how much is a minute worth, it depends on whether it is to save lives, it's worth a lot. If it is to diagnose cancer, it's worth a lot. If it is for us to have one additional minute with anybody we love, it's worth a lot. But if we're talking about production for economic activities, then maybe that's not worth as much. But it could be worth for what each and every one of us and those who have private initiative, for example, can maintain their working positions. And those who are more attuned with AI discussions can see that many companies that were celebrated, and I think that this was a sadistic celebration without a lawyer specialized in crisis to let them know that it was not nice to inform that 100 employees were let go and they now spend a fifth of that amount. They are already going back to hiring these people. And we who are a bit older, more mature, and have been reached by age and are not as savvy as young people, but we have life experience, we have the capacity to evaluate the consequences of certain actions and certain implementations in companies will have. So then we will have an economic impact with the differentiation of prices based on SLA. So we go from the neutrality, the beautiful neutrality of the civil framework and go into an economic game. And why? Because the civil framework does not meet the needs of the technological evolution we've had since 2014 to this day. Facing this and facing the fact that we need to discuss the civil framework, just as we need to discuss, for example, the Consumer Defense Code, because when it was conceived for retail with open doors, and now it regulates retail from the distance of a click. We will continue giving steps backwards while the whole world gives steps forward. I also call your attention to another fact, and this has to do with the policy announced by the Communications Department, the National Policy for Submarine Cables. I think that yesterday we had a presentation that demonstrated that through the Amazon rivers, and I have thought in that region. That river is literally an ocean. We already have cables in there to take connectivity, to take internet to those communities. I've had students who were on a boat for hours to watch a class because there was nothing anywhere close to where they were. So when we see that our communications ministry is also concerned about that, this is not just a business concern. It's not something only based on results, on latency, and it's not for us to remain competitive. We can see that in the past 4 or 5 years, some people will say that we are moving in the direction of a third world war. The fact is that we have different conflict scenarios. Some of these conflicts caused by other factors, and I read a very interesting sentence. Whenever the U.S. Fights for the freedom of countries, they find oil, just by chance. I went there to free the people and I found oil accidentally. So we can see those things. And of course, I don't want to talk about politics because this is not what we're doing here. We're talking about geopolitics and conflicts. These conflicts could harm us. And then when we talk about being prepared, we have to understand the following. First of all, São Paulo, for obvious reasons, and Rio de Janeiro, Eduardo Paes, despite the heat we have, swears that we will be the data center city in Brazil, and we will be if he wins the election. But Fortaleza is the main hub, because it is already prepared, because it has enough conditions to do it, and because they have qualified labor, and geographically speaking, they are closer so that they can avoid or mitigate risks that we are reached by these movements. So that we don't think that this has to do with Black Mirror, with dystopic TV series. We are talking about what is forming around our country, because we don't only have a capacity with brilliant minds to work with technology. We have some of the rare land reserves that are very important, some of the most important and strongest ones worldwide. And so, if somebody is a little bit less prepared, technically speaking, they can look at Brazil and say, okay, I will go there too. So if we do not have policies in place which prepare not only submarine cables, but satellites, land cables, because we need to remain connected regardless of everything that is good and that Fortaleza has to offer. So we can have large companies living in Brazil, and then the Netflix CFO has announced, because of a consultation regarding SID, and the answer by Scania went beyond the result desired, leading to losses for Netflix's.
prejuízo, mas talvez resultado de saída financeira que ela não tem em nenhum lugar do mundo.
And then
Fez questão de vir
they really wanted to come talk about the Brazil-related cost and how difficult it is.
Eu sou da área de auditoria e tributário,
I
não
work
faço tributário,
with
mas os meus colegas que o fazem dizem
audits,
que a
and
reforma
also
tributária
I have some of my colleagues that work with tax reform that told me that the current tax reform is far from simplifying the system, and we need to be concerned about that. So we also have network slicing. Well, I think I went backwards.
Uma solução que se pensa aqui.
A possible solution would be continuous algorithm auction. So to think in communication just as the stock market, neutrality as it stands today in our legal framework has not been able to handle that. So we need continuous algorithm auction. So today we see that people do not buy the internet, they buy screen time. And then to hand the internet to an Einstein that will perform robotic surgery. And somebody who will spend the day on Instagram. Although people do it because they are exercising their economic power, but we need to think about risks and consequences. And that will also allow us to serve Einstein and then to think about how to work with Instagram or TikTok so that we can ensure technology innovation without sacrificing the equity of the digital ecosystem. Well, I apologize. I really did not get my slides right now. Well, we don't have much time. But the study that I conduct addresses other issues. And although my presentation was short, I'd like to say that, well, I am extremely happy for how I was welcomed here. Very technical forum, but I'm very close, although I have no conditions to technically compete with you, but I like to thank you for the opportunity. These are my contacts. So you can find me also on Instagram. And if you allow me, I believe you have no questions to me, but I actually have a request. March marks the month of women, but the number of feminicides is just increasing. So let me quote a journalist. I was really touched by her talk. As a woman working in a world dominated by men, I was never paid less just because I'm a woman. But I think it's important that we teach our children it's important that we teach boys to never hurt women, and women should never forgive any kind of abuse. We are all exposed to that, right? So the second time that happens to you, that is an option. And
totalmente fora do que a
I
gente
know
está
that this
conversando
is
aqui,
outside
mas eu,
off
como
topic,
mulher,
but as a
não
woman,
podia deixar de
I
falar sobre
really
isso e de agradecer a vocês
had to
por
talk
todo o
about
respeito,
this
por
and
todo o
to thank you
carinho,
for
por
your
aceitarem
respect, for
essa proposta
your
de
warm
falar,
welcome,
de
for
plantar
giving me
essa
the
sementinha que ela
opportunity
vem, na
to come
verdade,
over
muito
here and
mais
to
numa
plant this
semente do
seed.
tema da palestra do que necessariamente do que foi falado, e eu tenho plena consciência disso.
And
Então,
with
parabenizar
that, I'd
cada
like
de
to
vocês
close. I'd
pelo
like to
trabalho que
commend
fazem
each
e
one of you
agradecer
for the
pelo
work
que me ouviram.
you carry out,
E
and thank you
até a
very
próxima,
much.
se um dia vocês
And I
acharem
hope
que dá
we
para
can
voltar
see
para
each
falar
other
mais.
again.
Fiquem todos com Deus. Muito obrigada.
Okay, thank you.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you.
Uma lembrança do
So this is just a memento from this
tirar uma foto.
forum.
Muito obrigado, Malu.
De nada.
Thank you.
Agora, para fazer o
All right, so now for closing this event, I'd like to invite moderators.
montar o evento, ele tem que trabalhar
He
pouco,
was in
né? Se ele
charge of
descansando, tranquilo.
organizing this event, so let's have him working a little bit.
Ele falou que ia me chamar, eu achei que ele estava zoando, mas
Well, I
é
actually did
sério.
not believe he was gonna call me.
Gente, o que eu posso dizer? Amanhã
What
tem o
can I
backup,
say?
né? O fórum
Tomorrow we have the
onde a gente
backup
vai fazer o
forum,
lançamento do desafio backup.
when we will launch the challenge
Bastante interessantes
with very
sobre
interesting
segurança com o pessoal
talks. We will talk about security with Tiago,
com o Gondim, que a gente encomendou
with
alguns temas
Gondim.
específicos para o Gondim.
We have asked Gondim to address some specific issues. What was it about? I forgot.
Depois de 2 dias de evento,
After
sobre
2 days,
BC38,
BC38 anti-spoofing and many other things.
de CPS e várias outras coisas que o pessoal
So
do CertBR falou,
different
a gente notifica
search
provedor,
backs.
provedor,
And people say, no, we notify providers, but things have not improved. So we asked Gondim to address specific issues that are extremely important when it comes to unsolved issues. Lucimara will talk about ransomware, which is also a very scary subject. And I'd like to invite you all to join us tomorrow. It's just a half-day event, but you're all invited to join us. I'd like to thank you for staying with us. It's been a very long day, but I am extremely happy with the discussions, the technical presentations, and your participation. So I can only thank you. Also for those who are following us on YouTube. So thank you very much. And with that, we close IX Forum Fortaleza 2026. Thank you. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.